China wants Taiwan badly, and it seems to be super confident about being able to pull off a successful invasion. But there are a few things it hasn't taken into consideration in its master plan. You see, China and Taiwan have been at each other's throats for decades, with tensions soaring to new heights in recent years and the world seemingly on the brink of World War III. It's impossible not to wonder what would happen in the event of a full-scale Chinese invasion of Taiwan. On the surface, China is the favorite to win this fight, with their military and economy being superior in almost every area. But no one will know for sure until the bullets start flying. As Mike Tyson once said, everyone has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. Now that begs the question, could China actually conquer Taiwan through military intervention? To properly tell this story, we have to go back to the beginning. Taiwan came under Japanese control beginning in 1895 and lasting until World War II ended in 1945. During this time, the Taiwanese people suffered unimaginable hardships, discrimination, and even enslavement in some cases. When Japan surrendered all of its ill-gotten territorial possessions in late 1945, Taiwan's future was uncertain. China was embroiled in a devastating civil war that was shaking its society down to its foundation. On one side, you had the Chinese Communist Party, led by Mao Zedong, and on the other side was Chiang Kai-shek, a former US ally against the Japanese and leader of the Nationalist Party. In the late 1940s, being friends with communists wasn't exactly popular, so the United States bet on Chiang Kai-shek. The war did not go well for them, and the nationalists eventually pulled all of their forces back to Taiwan. They established the island as their final stand and turned it into a fortress that has stood the test of time. Now this is where the root of the problem lies. The war never officially ended, with both sides claiming ownership of the island and no one willing to compromise. The communists claimed that Taiwan was traditionally a Chinese province and should be brought back into the fold with the rest of the country. Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists claimed that Taiwan may have been historically Chinese but was not part of a modern China, which was founded during the 1911 revolution that overthrew the Qing dynasty, and thus should be independent. So here they sit, once brothers, now bitter enemies, staring at each other across 80 miles of water. With Taiwan democratizing itself throughout the 80s and 90s, it's been in the middle of incredible changes to the global economic and political landscape. Its relationship with the United States has only deepened, and its role on the world stage expanded. Hailed as a bastion of democracy, Taiwan has found itself at the center of an ideological heavyweight boxing match between East and West. Their economic importance also cannot be overstated. Much of the world's electronics, including phones, computers, and gaming consoles, require computer chips, the vast majority of which are produced in Taiwan. Whatever way you are watching this right now, there's a good chance parts of it come from Taiwan. Taiwanese manufacturing accounts for about 65% of the world market, with one Taiwanese company, the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, or TSMC, producing over half of the world's chips by itself. Since 1949, the battle lines have been drawn. Tensions have risen, lowered, and risen again, but we have never been closer to an all-out war between China and Taiwan than we are now. Here are 5 reasons why a Chinese invasion of Taiwan would fail. Reason number 1. Geography. Remember geography in school? For some kids, it's probably the most boring thing they've ever had to sit through in their lives. But I would venture a guess that if you're watching this channel, you weren't one of those kids. It's also one of the main factors that could swing the pendulum in Taiwan's favor. Taiwan is situated southeast of mainland China, separated by the Taiwan Strait, at the intersection of the East China Sea and the South China Sea. With a climate ranging from tropical to subtropical, the weather can be unpredictable at times. Parts of the island can even have different weather patterns a few miles apart from each other. Typhoons, dense fog, high winds, 2 monsoon seasons, tropical storms, and possible 20-foot waves make any invasion risky. Now, why is the weather such an advantage here? That's because, as it currently stands, China would most likely attempt an amphibious invasion as the primary method of attack, with an airborne assault coming soon after, and of course a blanket of withering cover fire provided by their Navy and Air Force. That's all well and good, but if the rain is unrelenting, the Navy can't get a straight shot because of the rolling ocean, and the Air Force can't even take off because of a wall of fog, then the invasion probably isn't going to go so well. There is only a small window of time during the summer months when conditions for an invasion would even be feasible. The geographical advantages don't end there. Around Taiwan are over 100 small islands, and these islands have been equipped with a variety of defense systems, including surface-to-air and anti-ship missiles. Getting the Chinese Navy across the strait and into position will be tough enough, but the whole way they will face a gauntlet of fire. Even choosing which beach to land on has its difficulties, as there are only about a dozen suitable beaches on which the People's Liberation Army, or PLA, could land, and even then they are rugged. At low tide, Chinese tanks would be particularly exposed to anti-armor and artillery fire due to the long stretches of muddy, barren coastline. Where does that fire come from? That would be the multiple steep and rugged mountain ranges that cover Taiwan. Historically, mountain ranges have been a defender's best friend. From antiquity to the present, using mountains has been the key to victory for many an outnumbered army. Taiwan's strategy is no different, as they use their topography to their advantage and have turned the island into a fortress. The mountains are home to a network of caves and tunnels used for everything from defensive strongpoints to logistical support. It's from these caves and tunnels that the Taiwanese defenders will rain down death and destruction on the Chinese as they attempt to establish a beachhead. The task of the PLA is made even more difficult by the fact they would have to go into the urban and mountainous areas simultaneously with airborne troops if they wanted a chance of victory. Always thinking one step ahead, Taiwan has one last trick up its sleeve that makes its geography such a valuable asset. They make their geography work for them using something called A2AD, Anti-Access Area Denial. A2AD basically means that through precision weapon systems such as drones, missiles, artillery, etc., the attackers are guided into the areas where the defenders want them to go and where the greatest amount of damage can be inflicted. For instance, if Taiwan wanted the PLA to land on specific beaches on the western side of the island, they could concentrate their anti-ship missiles and drone strikes on anything that was trying to cross over to the eastern side, thus making the western approach the only viable option. A2AD is a part of China's strategy as well, and it's fair to say that whoever is able to control where and when the actual fighting takes place could very well control the outcome of the battle. Weather, topography, and controlling the battlefield are crucial elements to Taiwan's success, but the next reason is what happens when the rubber meets the road. Reason number 2. Defense in depth. Any good military commander will tell you that to truly be effective, you have to know your history. The Taiwanese have really taken this lesson to heart, as they have adopted a strategy similar to one the Japanese employed during the Pacific Theater of World War II. To even the casual military history fan, the name Iwo Jima conjures up images of guerrilla-style warfare and the Japanese defenders using every inch of the island above and below ground to turn it into a slaughterhouse. While the Marine Corps and naval forces of the United States eventually did triumph at Iwo, it came at great cost. Taiwan finds itself in a similar situation to that of the Iwo Jima defenders. They face an amphibious invasion by an overwhelming foe, and their only options are to hold out until reinforcements arrive, inflict such horrific casualties that the invader retreats, or death. As previously stated, the Taiwanese have a big advantage when it comes to defensive warfare, that being their topography. Rugged mountains cross the island and are a natural fortress against invasion. But what makes them so valuable is how they are being used. The Chinese will try to soften up Taiwanese positions with a preliminary bombardment from the Navy or from missiles, but the Taiwanese are ready. Much like the defenders on Iwo, the Taiwanese have constructed an unknown number of caves, bunkers, support stations, and tunnels through the mountains and over the island itself. These defensive and support installations allow the defenders to inflict damage and create chaos while being relatively unseen. In addition to their potential destructive uses, the caves and tunnels are also crucial for maintaining supplies and fighting ability. This infrastructure they have created allows them to move men, weapons, and supplies from one point to another without being exposed to danger. A great example of this is the tunnel complex near Kiashan Air Force Base on Taiwan's eastern side. The complex near Kiashan is capable of housing, repairing, and arming over 200 aircraft. It also provides support facilities for the Taiwanese defenders, such as a hospital and supply warehouses. There are multiple complexes like Kiashan around the island, and they are absolutely crucial to Taiwan maintaining control of its airspace and giving its military the best chance it has to win. While all this sounds great on paper, China does get a say in what happens as well. They won't just roll over. The Chinese strategy has been and always will be to overwhelm Taiwan with its larger military. China believes that to conquer Taiwan and subdue the population, they need a 3-to-1 advantage, which comes out to about 1.3 to 2.5 million Chinese soldiers. To give some context, China has about 2.1 million active troops, compared to Taiwan's active troops, which number about 170,000. The Taiwanese choose to play what some NBA fans might call small ball. Small ball is where a smaller, less physically strong team chooses to rely on their speed, agility, and discipline to win games. Go ahead and ask the Golden State Warriors how that strategy has been working out so far. Taiwan's version of Steph Curry, aka someone who runs circles around you and then hits three-pointers until you no longer have the will to continue, is mobile asymmetrical weapon systems. Mobile asymmetrical weapon systems are things like the Javelin or Stinger missiles, weapons that are portable but also devastating to the enemy, maximizing your advantages like stealth and speed while minimizing the enemy's armor and numerical advantage. This tactic has proven devastatingly effective in Ukraine, as Ukrainian forces strike from wherever they need to and level the playing field by taking out vast numbers of Russian armor. Similar results could be achieved in the wake of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. This is where defensive fortifications and infrastructure come into play. The goals of guerrilla warfare are to unexpectedly and decisively strike the enemy and then melt away unharmed, preparing to strike again. With their spread-out, hidden, well-fortified, and well-provisioned defensive works, the Taiwanese military can, theoretically, do to the PLA what smaller armies have done to larger ones for centuries: slowly bleed them dry. Combine that with an esprit de corps that usually brings a nation together when an invading army arrives on the doorstep, the Chinese are in trouble. Especially when you consider that the Chinese military hasn't fought anyone since 1979, they might be a little rusty. There is one part of their plan, though, that they have absolutely no experience with in times of war: the internet. How it's used and how available it is to both sides could have a critical role in the outcome of a potential invasion. Reason number 3. Satellite communications. Taiwanese internet connection internally and externally is primarily reliant on a series of undersea cables. Is this so hilariously vulnerable that it has to be a decoy of some kind? Hard to say, but one thing is certain: from the moment the invasion begins, China will unleash a devastating cyber attack on Taiwan and sever those cables. If internet connection is lost or is hit by cyber attacks, it will have crippling effects on the civilians and military. From multi-million-dollar weapons systems to the infantry sitting in the trenches, internet connection is taking on a larger role in warfare than ever before and can be the difference between life and death for many soldiers. Starlink and other companies like it are a beacon of hope for the Taiwanese defenders. Utilizing satellite internet connection, troops on the ground can feel confident in their internal communications, as well as their ability to coordinate drone and artillery strikes. Externally, the connection would be used to communicate with the outside world and keep Taiwanese allies up to date on the evolving situation, something that might prove decisive as the battle goes on. Trying to stop the flow of disinformation and show the world the true situation on the ground has been critical for the Ukrainian armed forces and President Zelensky. Why is that important? According to the Greek dramatist Aeschylus, in war, truth is the first casualty. On the civilian side of things, the Taiwanese government has to stay in control of what information their population receives. If the Chinese are allowed to control the narrative and influence the Taiwanese people using propaganda, it might destroy their will to fight before the battle even begins. Keeping Taiwan in the dark and limiting its technological capabilities is a cornerstone of the Chinese strategy. Companies like Starlink are making this much more difficult. Reason number 4. International support. It's no secret that the United States and other major world powers are staunch supporters of Taiwanese independence and autonomy. The United States is the main weapons provider for Taiwan and has defensive agreements that could bring US firepower to the South China Sea in the event of an invasion. President Xi and the Chinese government are well aware of this arrangement, and it's one of the main deterrents that keep their forces on Chinese soil. If a major military collision were to kick off, the full might of the United States military would, theoretically, be riding to Taiwan's aid. It is theoretical because the wording of the agreement, the Taiwan Relations Act, is rather vague and implies the US would intervene militarily but does not directly say it. The threat of US intervention has done the trick so far and has convinced the Chinese to stay put. As it currently stands, the US has bases all over the Pacific, but the most important ones in this situation are those located within Japan and the Philippines. US forces have been stationed in Japan since World War II ended and have turned the country into a vital component of the US defense plan in the Pacific. With over 20 bases in the country, US forces can supply, support, and launch major military operations with terrifying speed. The US presence in the Philippines is equally as important to deterring China and has been growing larger in recent years. The US signed the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, EDCA, with the Philippine government back in 2014. This allowed them to build 9 military bases, rotate troops through the country, and train local forces. With both of these major areas of operation so close to Taiwan, it's reasonably fair to say that any incursion by the Chinese would be met with good old American lead. If that were to happen, all Taiwan would have to do is hold out until they could be reinforced, which could turn China's situation from a localized operation to a full-scale international catastrophe. A catastrophe that would spill over into every facet of their society, including the economy. Reason number 5. Economic disaster. One of the main reasons why Taiwan is so crucially important to the rest of the world is its ability to manufacture semiconductors or computer chips. They are the world leaders in quantity and quality, producing 65% of the world's semiconductors. If production were to suddenly stop in the event of something like an invasion, the world economy would be upended. A stunning amount of what the world uses in its businesses and personal lives requires semiconductors. Everything from computers to smartphones, refrigerators and cars, to military technology, and even producing clean energy. The semiconductor shortage the world saw from 2020 to 21 was a minuscule preview of what could happen if that crucial supply was cut off. China would certainly be affected by this, as their cross-channel trade with Taiwan is estimated to be worth around $50 billion, and the steady flow of semiconductors is the lifeblood of the manufacturing sector of their economy. The effects on the Chinese economy and its people would be nothing short of disastrous. China, the US, and the rest of the world are working on producing their own semiconductors, but are still years away from producing the same quality that are produced in Taiwan. In the event of a Chinese invasion, the PLA would attempt to seize the factories and manufacturing plants where the semiconductors are produced. All they would find, however, would be ashes, or at the very least, inoperable machinery, as the Taiwanese and the rest of the world would rather tank the economy and halt production than give the Chinese a global monopoly on such a precious resource. A blow of this magnitude to the Chinese semiconductor and electronics manufacturing industry would have ramifications that would be felt for years to come, and would certainly affect their ability to fight a war. Another important economic deterrent would be the sanctions that would be imposed on China if they decide to invade. As seen with Russia since its invasion of Ukraine, the international community has hit Russia with crippling sanctions and decimated its economy. China's reliance on imports and exports could be the soft underbelly that would deter or cause an invasion to fail. About 20% of the Chinese economy is exports, and has seen that percentage gradually increase since COVID. Being unable to export their manufactured goods due to sanctions would create an unprecedented economic disaster for Xi's government. In addition to this, China is becoming increasingly reliant on food imports due to their low cost and diminishing amount of Chinese farmland caused by over-fertilization and environmental degradation. China's rising level of food insecurity means that they are vulnerable to food crises and civil disturbances. If the invasion does happen, China would be hit with multiple sanctions that would greatly limit its ability to import anything, including food. The last food crisis in China, known as the Great Famine, lasted from 1959 to 61 and is the largest famine in human history, with over 30 million dead as a result. At present, these economic factors seem to be enough to deter invasion, but if an invasion was to happen, they would surely be one of the main causes of failure for the Chinese. You can't fight a war without money or food. Looking at all the information we have available, we still can't predict what will happen with 100% certainty, but I think it's safe to say that Taiwan is not the pushover that China would have you believe it is. Taiwan can win, or at the very least delay until the cavalry arrives, but it would need a lot of factors to go its way. The real question is whether or not China has the stomach for a prolonged and bloody conflict, the likes of which few Chinese citizens have ever seen. It ain't the size of the dog in the fight, it's the size of the fight in the dog. Let us know what you think, and what you think the implications of such an invasion would be down in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe as well for more military analysis from military experts. China wants Taiwan badly, and it seems to be super confident about being able to pull off a successful invasion. But there are a few things it hasn't taken into consideration in its master plan. You see, China and Taiwan have been at each other's throats for decades, with tensions soaring to new heights in recent years and the world seemingly on the brink of World War III. It's impossible not to wonder what would happen in the event of a full-scale Chinese invasion of Taiwan. On the surface, China is the favorite to win this fight, with their military and economy being superior in almost every area. But no one will know for sure until the bullets start flying. As Mike Tyson once said, everyone has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. Now that begs the question, could China actually conquer Taiwan through military intervention? To properly tell this story, we have to go back to the beginning. Taiwan came under Japanese control beginning in 1895 and lasting until World War II ended in 1945. During this time, the Taiwanese people suffered unimaginable hardships, discrimination, and even enslavement in some cases. When Japan surrendered all of its ill-gotten territorial possessions in late 1945, Taiwan's future was uncertain. China was embroiled in a devastating civil war that was shaking its society down to its foundation. On one side, you had the Chinese Communist Party, led by Mao Zedong, and on the other side was Chiang Kai-shek, a former US ally against the Japanese and leader of the Nationalist Party. In the late 1940s, being friends with communists wasn't exactly popular, so the United States bet on Chiang Kai-shek. The war did not go well for them, and the nationalists eventually pulled all of their forces back to Taiwan. They established the island as their final stand and turned it into a fortress that has stood the test of time. Now this is where the root of the problem lies. The war never officially ended, with both sides claiming ownership of the island and no one willing to compromise. The communists claimed that Taiwan was traditionally a Chinese province and should be brought back into the fold with the rest of the country. Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists claimed that Taiwan may have been historically Chinese but was not part of a modern China, which was founded during the 1911 revolution that overthrew the Qing dynasty, and thus should be independent. So here they sit, once brothers, now bitter enemies, staring at each other across 80 miles of water. With Taiwan democratizing itself throughout the 80s and 90s, it's been in the middle of incredible changes to the global economic and political landscape. Its relationship with the United States has only deepened, and its role on the world stage expanded. Hailed as a bastion of democracy, Taiwan has found itself at the center of an ideological heavyweight boxing match between East and West. Their economic importance also cannot be overstated. Much of the world's electronics, including phones, computers, and gaming consoles, require computer chips, the vast majority of which are produced in Taiwan. Whatever way you are watching this right now, there's a good chance parts of it come from Taiwan. Taiwanese manufacturing accounts for about 65% of the world market, with one Taiwanese company, the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, or TSMC, producing over half of the world's chips by itself. Since 1949, the battle lines have been drawn. Tensions have risen, lowered, and risen again, but we have never been closer to an all-out war between China and Taiwan than we are now. Here are 5 reasons why a Chinese invasion of Taiwan would fail. Reason number 1. Geography. Remember geography in school? For some kids, it's probably the most boring thing they've ever had to sit through in their lives. But I would venture a guess that if you're watching this channel, you weren't one of those kids. It's also one of the main factors that could swing the pendulum in Taiwan's favor. Taiwan is situated southeast of mainland China, separated by the Taiwan Strait, at the intersection of the East China Sea and the South China Sea. With a climate ranging from tropical to subtropical, the weather can be unpredictable at times. Parts of the island can even have different weather patterns a few miles apart from each other. Typhoons, dense fog, high winds, 2 monsoon seasons, tropical storms, and possible 20-foot waves make any invasion risky. Now, why is the weather such an advantage here? That's because, as it currently stands, China would most likely attempt an amphibious invasion as the primary method of attack, with an airborne assault coming soon after, and of course a blanket of withering cover fire provided by their Navy and Air Force. That's all well and good, but if the rain is unrelenting, the Navy can't get a straight shot because of the rolling ocean, and the Air Force can't even take off because of a wall of fog, then the invasion probably isn't going to go so well. There is only a small window of time during the summer months when conditions for an invasion would even be feasible. The geographical advantages don't end there. Around Taiwan are over 100 small islands, and these islands have been equipped with a variety of defense systems, including surface-to-air and anti-ship missiles. Getting the Chinese Navy across the strait and into position will be tough enough, but the whole way they will face a gauntlet of fire. Even choosing which beach to land on has its difficulties, as there are only about a dozen suitable beaches on which the People's Liberation Army, or PLA, could land, and even then they are rugged. At low tide, Chinese tanks would be particularly exposed to anti-armor and artillery fire due to the long stretches of muddy, barren coastline. Where does that fire come from? That would be the multiple steep and rugged mountain ranges that cover Taiwan. Historically, mountain ranges have been a defender's best friend. From antiquity to the present, using mountains has been the key to victory for many an outnumbered army. Taiwan's strategy is no different, as they use their topography to their advantage and have turned the island into a fortress. The mountains are home to a network of caves and tunnels used for everything from defensive strongpoints to logistical support. It's from these caves and tunnels that the Taiwanese defenders will rain down death and destruction on the Chinese as they attempt to establish a beachhead. The task of the PLA is made even more difficult by the fact they would have to go into the urban and mountainous areas simultaneously with airborne troops if they wanted a chance of victory. Always thinking one step ahead, Taiwan has one last trick up its sleeve that makes its geography such a valuable asset. They make their geography work for them using something called A2AD, Anti-Access Area Denial. A2AD basically means that through precision weapon systems such as drones, missiles, artillery, etc., the attackers are guided into the areas where the defenders want them to go and where the greatest amount of damage can be inflicted. For instance, if Taiwan wanted the PLA to land on specific beaches on the western side of the island, they could concentrate their anti-ship missiles and drone strikes on anything that was trying to cross over to the eastern side, thus making the western approach the only viable option. A2AD is a part of China's strategy as well, and it's fair to say that whoever is able to control where and when the actual fighting takes place could very well control the outcome of the battle. Weather, topography, and controlling the battlefield are crucial elements to Taiwan's success, but the next reason is what happens when the rubber meets the road. Reason number 2. Defense in depth. Any good military commander will tell you that to truly be effective, you have to know your history. The Taiwanese have really taken this lesson to heart, as they have adopted a strategy similar to one the Japanese employed during the Pacific Theater of World War II. To even the casual military history fan, the name Iwo Jima conjures up images of guerrilla-style warfare and the Japanese defenders using every inch of the island above and below ground to turn it into a slaughterhouse. While the Marine Corps and naval forces of the United States eventually did triumph at Iwo, it came at great cost. Taiwan finds itself in a similar situation to that of the Iwo Jima defenders. They face an amphibious invasion by an overwhelming foe, and their only options are to hold out until reinforcements arrive, inflict such horrific casualties that the invader retreats, or death. As previously stated, the Taiwanese have a big advantage when it comes to defensive warfare, that being their topography. Rugged mountains cross the island and are a natural fortress against invasion. But what makes them so valuable is how they are being used. The Chinese will try to soften up Taiwanese positions with a preliminary bombardment from the Navy or from missiles, but the Taiwanese are ready. Much like the defenders on Iwo, the Taiwanese have constructed an unknown number of caves, bunkers, support stations, and tunnels through the mountains and over the island itself. These defensive and support installations allow the defenders to inflict damage and create chaos while being relatively unseen. In addition to their potential destructive uses, the caves and tunnels are also crucial for maintaining supplies and fighting ability. This infrastructure they have created allows them to move men, weapons, and supplies from one point to another without being exposed to danger. A great example of this is the tunnel complex near Kiashan Air Force Base on Taiwan's eastern side. The complex near Kiashan is capable of housing, repairing, and arming over 200 aircraft. It also provides support facilities for the Taiwanese defenders, such as a hospital and supply warehouses. There are multiple complexes like Kiashan around the island, and they are absolutely crucial to Taiwan maintaining control of its airspace and giving its military the best chance it has to win. While all this sounds great on paper, China does get a say in what happens as well. They won't just roll over. The Chinese strategy has been and always will be to overwhelm Taiwan with its larger military. China believes that to conquer Taiwan and subdue the population, they need a 3-to-1 advantage, which comes out to about 1.3 to 2.5 million Chinese soldiers. To give some context, China has about 2.1 million active troops, compared to Taiwan's active troops, which number about 170,000. The Taiwanese choose to play what some NBA fans might call small ball. Small ball is where a smaller, less physically strong team chooses to rely on their speed, agility, and discipline to win games. Go ahead and ask the Golden State Warriors how that strategy has been working out so far. Taiwan's version of Steph Curry, aka someone who runs circles around you and then hits three-pointers until you no longer have the will to continue, is mobile asymmetrical weapon systems. Mobile asymmetrical weapon systems are things like the Javelin or Stinger missiles, weapons that are portable but also devastating to the enemy, maximizing your advantages like stealth and speed while minimizing the enemy's armor and numerical advantage. This tactic has proven devastatingly effective in Ukraine, as Ukrainian forces strike from wherever they need to and level the playing field by taking out vast numbers of Russian armor. Similar results could be achieved in the wake of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. This is where defensive fortifications and infrastructure come into play. The goals of guerrilla warfare are to unexpectedly and decisively strike the enemy and then melt away unharmed, preparing to strike again. With their spread-out, hidden, well-fortified, and well-provisioned defensive works, the Taiwanese military can, theoretically, do to the PLA what smaller armies have done to larger ones for centuries: slowly bleed them dry. Combine that with an esprit de corps that usually brings a nation together when an invading army arrives on the doorstep, the Chinese are in trouble. Especially when you consider that the Chinese military hasn't fought anyone since 1979, they might be a little rusty. There is one part of their plan, though, that they have absolutely no experience with in times of war: the internet. How it's used and how available it is to both sides could have a critical role in the outcome of a potential invasion. Reason number 3. Satellite communications. Taiwanese internet connection internally and externally is primarily reliant on a series of undersea cables. Is this so hilariously vulnerable that it has to be a decoy of some kind? Hard to say, but one thing is certain: from the moment the invasion begins, China will unleash a devastating cyber attack on Taiwan and sever those cables. If internet connection is lost or is hit by cyber attacks, it will have crippling effects on the civilians and military. From multi-million-dollar weapons systems to the infantry sitting in the trenches, internet connection is taking on a larger role in warfare than ever before and can be the difference between life and death for many soldiers. Starlink and other companies like it are a beacon of hope for the Taiwanese defenders. Utilizing satellite internet connection, troops on the ground can feel confident in their internal communications, as well as their ability to coordinate drone and artillery strikes. Externally, the connection would be used to communicate with the outside world and keep Taiwanese allies up to date on the evolving situation, something that might prove decisive as the battle goes on. Trying to stop the flow of disinformation and show the world the true situation on the ground has been critical for the Ukrainian armed forces and President Zelensky. Why is that important? According to the Greek dramatist Aeschylus, in war, truth is the first casualty. On the civilian side of things, the Taiwanese government has to stay in control of what information their population receives. If the Chinese are allowed to control the narrative and influence the Taiwanese people using propaganda, it might destroy their will to fight before the battle even begins. Keeping Taiwan in the dark and limiting its technological capabilities is a cornerstone of the Chinese strategy. Companies like Starlink are making this much more difficult. Reason number 4. International support. It's no secret that the United States and other major world powers are staunch supporters of Taiwanese independence and autonomy. The United States is the main weapons provider for Taiwan and has defensive agreements that could bring US firepower to the South China Sea in the event of an invasion. President Xi and the Chinese government are well aware of this arrangement, and it's one of the main deterrents that keep their forces on Chinese soil. If a major military collision were to kick off, the full might of the United States military would, theoretically, be riding to Taiwan's aid. It is theoretical because the wording of the agreement, the Taiwan Relations Act, is rather vague and implies the US would intervene militarily but does not directly say it. The threat of US intervention has done the trick so far and has convinced the Chinese to stay put. As it currently stands, the US has bases all over the Pacific, but the most important ones in this situation are those located within Japan and the Philippines. US forces have been stationed in Japan since World War II ended and have turned the country into a vital component of the US defense plan in the Pacific. With over 20 bases in the country, US forces can supply, support, and launch major military operations with terrifying speed. The US presence in the Philippines is equally as important to deterring China and has been growing larger in recent years. The US signed the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, EDCA, with the Philippine government back in 2014. This allowed them to build 9 military bases, rotate troops through the country, and train local forces. With both of these major areas of operation so close to Taiwan, it's reasonably fair to say that any incursion by the Chinese would be met with good old American lead. If that were to happen, all Taiwan would have to do is hold out until they could be reinforced, which could turn China's situation from a localized operation to a full-scale international catastrophe. A catastrophe that would spill over into every facet of their society, including the economy. Reason number 5. Economic disaster. One of the main reasons why Taiwan is so crucially important to the rest of the world is its ability to manufacture semiconductors or computer chips. They are the world leaders in quantity and quality, producing 65% of the world's semiconductors. If production were to suddenly stop in the event of something like an invasion, the world economy would be upended. A stunning amount of what the world uses in its businesses and personal lives requires semiconductors. Everything from computers to smartphones, refrigerators and cars, to military technology, and even producing clean energy. The semiconductor shortage the world saw from 2020 to 21 was a minuscule preview of what could happen if that crucial supply was cut off. China would certainly be affected by this, as their cross-channel trade with Taiwan is estimated to be worth around $50 billion, and the steady flow of semiconductors is the lifeblood of the manufacturing sector of their economy. The effects on the Chinese economy and its people would be nothing short of disastrous. China, the US, and the rest of the world are working on producing their own semiconductors, but are still years away from producing the same quality that are produced in Taiwan. In the event of a Chinese invasion, the PLA would attempt to seize the factories and manufacturing plants where the semiconductors are produced. All they would find, however, would be ashes, or at the very least, inoperable machinery, as the Taiwanese and the rest of the world would rather tank the economy and halt production than give the Chinese a global monopoly on such a precious resource. A blow of this magnitude to the Chinese semiconductor and electronics manufacturing industry would have ramifications that would be felt for years to come, and would certainly affect their ability to fight a war. Another important economic deterrent would be the sanctions that would be imposed on China if they decide to invade. As seen with Russia since its invasion of Ukraine, the international community has hit Russia with crippling sanctions and decimated its economy. China's reliance on imports and exports could be the soft underbelly that would deter or cause an invasion to fail. About 20% of the Chinese economy is exports, and has seen that percentage gradually increase since COVID. Being unable to export their manufactured goods due to sanctions would create an unprecedented economic disaster for Xi's government. In addition to this, China is becoming increasingly reliant on food imports due to their low cost and diminishing amount of Chinese farmland caused by over-fertilization and environmental degradation. China's rising level of food insecurity means that they are vulnerable to food crises and civil disturbances. If the invasion does happen, China would be hit with multiple sanctions that would greatly limit its ability to import anything, including food. The last food crisis in China, known as the Great Famine, lasted from 1959 to 61 and is the largest famine in human history, with over 30 million dead as a result. At present, these economic factors seem to be enough to deter invasion, but if an invasion was to happen, they would surely be one of the main causes of failure for the Chinese. You can't fight a war without money or food. Looking at all the information we have available, we still can't predict what will happen with 100% certainty, but I think it's safe to say that Taiwan is not the pushover that China would have you believe it is. Taiwan can win, or at the very least delay until the cavalry arrives, but it would need a lot of factors to go its way. The real question is whether or not China has the stomach for a prolonged and bloody conflict, the likes of which few Chinese citizens have ever seen. It ain't the size of the dog in the fight, it's the size of the fight in the dog. Let us know what you think, and what you think the implications of such an invasion would be down in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe as well for more military analysis from military experts. China has had its eyes set on Taiwan since the 17th century, and recently its grabby, power-hungry hands have been reaching towards this semiconductor-rich and technologically important little island more aggressively than usual. If only it wasn't for that pesky Taiwan Relations Act, which requires the US to provide Taiwan with protection against anything that could jeopardize the security or the social or economic system of the people on Taiwan. Xi Jinping would probably already be all over Taiwan and its processing chips. Even so, China is not about to let go of the idea of fully taking over one of the world's most important economic focal points anytime soon. Exactly how worried should Taiwan be about China's potential invasion? When Russia invaded Ukraine in early 2022, it set off the largest conflict in Europe since World War II. Understandably, the surprise invasion sent shockwaves around the world, causing many countries to reevaluate their security. Nowhere was this more true than the island nation of Taiwan, another state with a large, threatening neighbor laying historical claim to its territory. Russia's invasion sparked fears of similar actions against Taiwan by China, a scenario which could destabilize not only East Asia, but potentially the entire world. How did Taiwan come to be such an important global economic center? One word: civil war. Here's what we mean. As with Russia and Ukraine, the shared history of Taiwan and China goes back hundreds of years. Throughout the 16th century, the Chinese gradually gained influence and control over the island, then known as Formosa through intermarriage and trade. By the late 17th century, the Qing dynasty officially incorporated Taiwan into its empire, by which point the island was mostly ethnically Han Chinese. In 1895, following its victory in the First Sino-Japanese War, Japan took control of Taiwan from China. The Japanese implemented economic and social reforms on the island, which led to limited modernization and industrialization. However, the occupation also resulted in widespread discrimination against Taiwanese people, who were viewed as inferior to the Japanese. With its loss at the end of World War II, Japan was forced to relinquish control of Taiwan, and the island was returned to Chinese rule. However, almost immediately, Taiwan became embroiled in the Chinese Civil War, which was raging at the time between the nationalists, led by Chiang Kai-shek, and the communists, led by Mao Zedong. In mainland China, the communists were victorious, and in 1949 established the People's Republic of China, or PRC. The defeated nationalists were forced to flee to Taiwan, where they established the Republic of China, or ROC. With both governments still claiming to be the legitimate government of China, no peace agreement was ever signed, and the civil war technically continues to this day. Under the nationalist government, Taiwan experienced significant economic growth and modernization. However, it was also a period of severe authoritarian rule, with limited political freedom and human rights abuses. In the 1980s, there was a growing movement for democracy and Taiwanese identity, which led to protests and eventually a transition to democratic rule of the island in the 1990s. Today, Taiwan remains a prosperous democracy, with a vibrant civil society, legal protections, and a strong sense of Taiwanese identity. On the mainland, the PRC also went through some spectacular transformations. Most of Mao's rule was extremely turbulent, with industrialization, but also the mass famine of the Great Leap Forward and political chaos and repression of the Cultural Revolution. Following Mao's death, the PRC's new leader, Deng Xiaoping, began a series of economic reforms in 1978. Fueled by the market-based policies, massive investment in infrastructure, and cheap labor, these reforms would give China decades GDP growth exceeding 10% per year, lifting hundreds of millions from poverty and leaving the country as the world's second largest economy today. Yet throughout this period of transformation, the issue of Taiwan never went away, with both sides continuing to claim legitimate rulership of China. Under the PRC's One China principle, no country with whom it held diplomatic relations could recognize the ROC. For much of the Cold War, most governments continued to recognize the ROC, keeping the Chinese Communist Party relatively isolated. This changed by 1979, when the US switched its official recognition to the PRC, naming it as the sole legal government of China. But while it officially recognized Taiwan as part of China, the US also continued unofficial relations with Taiwan. Among other things, this has entailed providing the island with billions in advanced military assistance to defend itself from a potential invasion and regularly sending the Navy through the Taiwan Strait. Today, Taiwan's status remains a highly contentious issue in China's relations with the US and others. China continues to view Taiwan as a renegade province that must be reunited with the mainland, while Taiwan sees itself as a separate and sovereign entity. Xi Jinping, the current leader of China, has reinforced this position, calling the reunification of Taiwan a historic mission and unshakable commitment for his government. Now, where have we heard that line before? Ah yes, Putin has been feeding it to the people of Russia as part of his war propaganda since February 2022. With the invasion of Ukraine and deteriorating relations between the US and China, many have begun to speculate about Taiwan. Will the island meet a similar fate? If so, would China fare better than Russia has? And if the US chooses to protect Taiwan, could such an invasion spiral into open conflict between superpowers? These questions are made more important by both Taiwan's role as the world's largest semiconductor manufacturer, a critical link in the modern global economy, and by America's purposefully ambiguous policy towards the issue. Their answers are also complex, since any invasion of Taiwan would look very different from Ukraine and could be far more costly for both sides, reflecting the island's unique circumstances and singular importance to our modern world. In terms of sheer numbers, it is clear that China would have the advantage against Taiwan in almost every way. China has the world's largest population at 1.4 billion, compared to only 23.5 million in Taiwan. And China is an economic superpower, worth $18.3 trillion GDP to Taiwan's $1.27 trillion. Similarly, China's armed forces, the People's Liberation Army or PLA, has over 2 million active forces to Taiwan's 169,000, as well as vastly more tanks, aircrafts, submarines, naval ships, and artillery. Its enormous military budget of $225 billion also dwarfs Taiwan's, leaving little doubt which is the stronger power in absolute terms. Yet, as the war in Ukraine has shown, numbers alone don't count for everything, and despite the odds against it, Taiwan's military and economy is still in a far better position than Ukraine's was prior to the Russian invasion. In 2021, the Taiwanese defense budget was over $15 billion, nearly 3 times that of Ukraine for the same year, while its overall GDP was nearly 5 times larger. But that's not all. Taiwan also has a modern military with advanced technology and well-trained soldiers. The US has been supplying the island with powerful weapons for decades, including F-16 fighter jets, upgraded Patriot missile batteries, Abrams tanks, and other advanced systems that Ukraine doesn't have or is only beginning to receive. While these would not close the military gap with China, it would put Taiwan in a better position than Ukraine was at the start of its invasion. Then there is the problem of the potential invasion itself. Unlike Ukraine and Russia, Taiwan does not share a land border with China, but is separated by the Taiwan Strait, a body of water still over 80 miles at its narrowest point. That means any invasion would have to be an amphibious assault. The lowest estimates of the Chinese forces necessary for a successful campaign are over 300,000. And to achieve the 3-to-1 superiority in numbers that most commanders look for in offensive operations, the PLA would need an invasion force of 1.3 to 2.5 million. In comparison, D-Day, the largest amphibious invasion in history up to this point, had only 156,000 total troops. Additionally, despite having better capabilities than Russia, the PLA has not seen combat since 1979, and few of its officers have real battle experience. Military experts still generally agree that China could take Taipei through massive force and numbers, but how easily and whether it could hold the territory for long are less clear. Additionally, the geography of Taiwan would work to its advantage in an invasion scenario. The country is actually made up of over 100 islands, many of them too small to see on a map. Most of the outer islands are packed with missiles, rocket systems, and artillery, while an extensive bunker system has been tunneled into the outer granite hills. The main island is rugged, with dense forests, and 258 mountains over 10,000 feet in elevation. And as China analyst Ian Easton has noted, unlike Normandy, the coastal terrain here is a defender's dream come true. Taiwan has only 14 small invasion beaches, and they are bordered by cliffs and urban jungles. Structures made of steel-reinforced concrete blanket the surrounding valleys. Taiwan gets hit by typhoons and earthquakes all the time, so each building and bridge is designed to withstand severe buffeting. This defensibility would also make it easier for an insurgency to form if China did take control of the island. Taiwan has a large and well-trained reserve force that could engage in guerrilla warfare and hide in tunnels and forests. And while gun ownership on the island is strictly regulated, civilian arms training has increased in recent years. The owner of one shooting range in Taipei told Reuters that attendees had tripled or quadrupled since the Russian invasion of Ukraine. As one tattoo artist and reservist put it, "Most people don't want to go to war. I also don't want to go to war, but in the unfortunate event of this really happening, I will be mentally prepared." The terrain in Taiwan, with its mountains and forests, would also make it difficult for the PLA to locate and neutralize any resistance. This would make an occupation of the island difficult and costly, potentially leading to a protracted conflict which could wear down Chinese morale. But the obstacles don't end there. Another difficulty China would face in an invasion is international support for Taiwan. While Taiwan only has official relations with 13 other countries due to the PRC's international pressure, it maintains strong unofficial relations with the US, Japan, and other powerful states. The question of whether the US would aid Taiwan against an invasion has long been a critical question. Since it began relations with the PRC, the United States has maintained a position of strategic ambiguity, purposefully not making clear whether it would respond to an attack on Taiwan. However, with the recent heightened tensions, this policy has come into question. When asked in late 2022 whether he would send US forces to defend the island, President Joe Biden replied yes, if in fact there was an unprecedented attack. Although a White House spokesperson later claimed the US policy had not changed, Biden's comments made it clear how vital Taiwan remains to US economic and military interests. If China launched a full-scale invasion, there is little doubt that the US would respond in some fashion, possibly through increased military aid to rebels, harsh economic sanctions on Chinese markets, or even the active deployment of advisors and troops to assist Taiwanese forces. US involvement would present a serious obstacle to China occupying or annexing the island for any length of time, especially since the PLA's capabilities and resources are still far less substantial than the US military. And with Taiwan in chaos, both China and the US would have difficulty supplying their military-industrial complexes. This points to another major difficulty China would face in invading Taiwan: the profound disruption it would cause to the world economy. While the invasion of Ukraine created chaos in energy markets and supply chains around the world, a Chinese invasion of Taiwan would cause far greater damage, pointing to just how important the island is to the modern world. This is primarily due to semiconductors, which are necessary for nearly all modern electronics, from smartphones to GPS to fighter jets and missile systems. As the electronic industry in the US picked up in the 1960s and 70s, semiconductors became increasingly sophisticated, allowing for massive advances in computing power. But beginning in the 1980s, companies began to outsource the highly technical and expensive process of fabricating semiconductors to East Asian countries with cheaper labor. Over the next several decades, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, or TSMC, would become the most successful example of this, making itself into the largest and most advanced semiconductor manufacturer in the world. Taiwan's market dominance is such that today more than 90% of global semiconductor manufacturing takes place on the island, making TSMC the 10th largest corporation in the world. And while the US is now taking strides to increase its domestic semiconductor manufacturing, Taiwan remains the linchpin to the industry, and thus to the modern digital economy. Here's the bad news. A Chinese invasion would catastrophically disrupt global supply chains and could lead to significant economic consequences, including shortages and recession. An active conflict on Taiwan would almost certainly slow down or halt fabrication of semiconductors and potentially damage or destroy the fabrication facilities. Furthermore, any military conflict would lead to a sharp decline in consumer confidence, and businesses would hesitate to invest in the region. This would ultimately harm China's economic output for years to come, as it is heavily dependent on exports, as well as on the uninterrupted production of semiconductors, which make up more than 50% of Taiwan's exports to the PRC. But while the economic consequences would certainly damage the Chinese economy, that is no guarantee an invasion will not happen. Taiwan's geopolitical value is great enough that Beijing may risk the consequences just to control Taiwan's fabrication facilities, which would give both China complete control over the industry and completely seal off America's supply of the most advanced semiconductors. This could theoretically allow China to gain the upper hand in everything from commercial electronics to artificial intelligence and weapons production. For all these reasons and more, it is clear that any conflict between China and Taiwan would be complex and have far-reaching consequences. Whoever controls the supply chain for semiconductors will most likely become the dominant power of the 21st century. While such a conflict still seems unlikely today, geopolitical pressures could certainly create the conditions for a Chinese invasion. However, even if that takes place, there is reason to believe that such an invasion would face tremendous difficulties and require nearly all of China's military capabilities. But what do you think? How likely is a Chinese invasion of Taiwan? And how would China fare in such a scenario? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more content from military experts. If you go ahead and spin the proverbial wheel of global worry today, there's a good chance you'll land on the words China and World War III. Unfortunately, there are several reasons for that, and they all lead to the question no one wants to think about. Is China getting ready for World War III? It's true that nowadays you can't go far without someone talking about the perils of Taiwanese reunification, artificial Chinese islands, Cold War 2.0, or the specifications of the latest hypersonic missile. Add to that the increasing frequency of Chinese incursions into Taiwanese airspace, Japan's recent decision to purchase hundreds of new weapons for its own defense, like these American-made Tomahawk missiles, and closer military cooperation between the US and Australia, and we are starting to see the signs of another global conflict on the horizon, one that is likely to begin somewhere in the Indo-Pacific. It all adds up to another doomsday scenario waiting in the wings, and some believe it could take place as early as 2024. Does China have a World War III plan in place, and if so, what does it look like? China's rise over the past few decades seems to indicate that the worrisome and likely answer to the first question is yes, and here's why. Tensions between China and the West have not been this high in a long time. Rewind several decades, and many experts would have laughed at you if you claimed you were a time traveler from the future and China posed a serious geopolitical threat to the international order. That's because the 1990s were a strange time, and not just because of the oversized jeans and kids' obsession with green slime. It was a period of untempered Western optimism. Yep, you heard that right, optimism. From our pessimism-soaked vantage point today, the geopolitical arc of that decade was almost unicorn-like, a surreal period of national unity, hope, and security, with the 9/11 terrorist attacks on the Twin Towers. But for a while, things seemed, well, good. Emerging victorious from its 45-year ideological standoff with the Soviet Union, for a brief unipolar moment in time, the United States enjoyed unmatched power and prestige on the global stage. There were no more near-peer threats. While terrorists and revolutionaries conspired at the peripheries of power, America's military and its coalition partners, equipped to the eyeballs with the latest technology and fresh off their rollicking victory in the Persian Gulf, bought into the idea that democracy was spreading and would continue to do so with assistance and persistence around the globe. It was in this geopolitical climate that things really started to change for China, not that many Western observers really noticed. Between 1949 and 1971, it had existed behind the Bamboo Curtain, a totalitarian dictatorship under the authoritarian communist revolutionary Mao Zedong. Things changed when the United States sought rapprochement with China in the 1970s, thereafter reopening diplomatic relations and turning China into a willing Cold War partner through strengthening economic relationships and a degree of exposure to the West it had not enjoyed since World War II. China started modernizing. A lot. Americans profited, China grew. As China grew, Americans hoped the exposure to Western values and ideas would liberalize and democratize China. There were social and cultural reforms amid the modernization, yes, but not many. China's benign growth lulled the West into a false sense of security. Some pundits argue that it was in the 1990s, the heyday of American optimism, that China started really playing the long game, hatching a secret 50-year plan to achieve the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation after a century of downturns. Entangling its economy with the United States, it grew fast enough to convince the West it deserved a place in the World Trade Organization, the WTO, something it achieved by the early 2000s. Yes, we will play by the rules of international order, Chinese leaders proclaimed, with enough zeal to make their Western partners proud. It was around then its economy started booming, growing almost 10% every year for the next 2 decades. Between 1980 and 2000, its GDP quadrupled. Starting at under $90 billion in 1980, it now hovers around $13 trillion, the fastest growing increase in human history. Hundreds of millions of Chinese residents were lifted out of poverty as the country's economic potential skyrocketed. As globalization continued and China received hundreds of billions of dollars of global investment, it established a trade footprint to rival much of the rest of the world, providing cheap labor that built most of the products now adorning your home, while becoming competitive in cutting-edge cyber, space, and technology sectors. It has long since become East Asia's economic titan par excellence. It thrived under the auspices of global capitalism. It took on some of the trappings of the West, especially in its business and trade practices, but it never really democratized. To this day, it maintains its communist, centralized authoritarian regime under the singular vision of its latest ruler, Xi Jinping. And Xi has a vision, all right. Having covertly flourished under the umbrella of American power for several decades, China is now preparing the next phase of its grand strategy to catapult itself into the realm of peerless global hegemon, one that can impose itself in its Indo-Pacific neighborhood at will while projecting enough global influence to shape the rules-based international order in its own image. It's taken them 14 five-year plans to get to that point, but they've finally arrived. Now China wants to build a community of common destiny, essentially a nice way of saying it wants to coercively achieve what it views the US doing all over the world, leading international organizations, becoming a political and economic model for developing countries, being able to project world-class military power all across the globe, all while leveraging its trade relationships, allies, and partners to achieve its interests, aka replace the United States as the world's leading state. They chose 2049 for the date to achieve all of this, the centenary of the founding of the People's Republic of China, PRC, but each successive milestone for modernization has amped up the tension between China and the West. National security insiders have been sounding alarm bells for a decade now, but only recently have things started to get real. Over the past 3 decades, China has spent its way to military might. In 2019, it was spending more than South Korea, Japan, India, Russia, and Taiwan combined, accounting for over half of Asian GDP and half of all Asian military expenditures. China didn't have to just outspend their competition, however. Over the past decade, a growing number of Western defense officials have started kicking themselves for not realizing the pitfalls of economic interdependence with China. It's been no secret that for decades, Chinese spies have been stealing valuable intellectual property, including US military secrets. Just look at their latest stealth fighter, the J-20. It's a surreal mashup of the latest stealth technology, the type you might get if an American F-22, F-35, and a Russian MiG-144 walked into a bar, had one too many, and started spilling their secrets within earshot of a Chinese spy. China has stolen immense amounts of data too. Some we unwittingly give them by opting in to use Chinese-owned platforms like TikTok, data that US officials claim gives them enough personal information to identify potential targets for intelligence collection and other subterfuge. Just like the West can and probably does, China uses this data to geolocate top national security targets, recruit spies, conduct massive remote cyber attacks, and steal military and technology secrets. The issue isn't just that China has shiny new advanced submarines, missiles, aircrafts, drones, and other toys to play with. It is that it's now looking like it has the logistics, infrastructure, and know-how to use them effectively. And that's something we need to explore further. As we all know, nation-states can't just fling military power around the globe willy-nilly. You have to have the national industrial base to build up your power, the domestic support to use it, the transport infrastructure to move it, agreements in place to base it, and an effective doctrine and strategy to employ it. It took the United States 4 years of total war and victory in 2 theaters to emerge as a bona fide global superpower after World War II. Were it not for the destabilization in the aftermath of that war and the exigencies of the Cold War that followed it, it would not have many of the military basing agreements or the alliances and partnerships it now enjoys around the world today. Many of those relationships and the infrastructure sustaining them took decades, even generations, to build. And today, that is something we often take for granted. But not China. They know the price of obscurity and the difficulty of restoring national power and prestige back to superpower levels. Their long-term strategy, in part, is to achieve the same degree of global agency that the United States enjoys. It too wants bases for its military all over the world, flourishing economic relationships, and safe trade routes for its commercial fleet. Without a world war to create the conditions for its rise to power, China has had to engineer its rise artificially, partially through guile and subterfuge, partially using state-sponsored initiatives that scream, "We are trying to go global, and we will make it happen whether you like it or not." One of China's global projects that stands out from the rest in terms of ambition, scale, and significance, the One Belt Road Initiative, or Belt and Road Initiative, BRI. Much like the ancient Silk Road that connected Chinese traders and goods with rich foreign markets, the BRI strives to achieve the same degree of global influence for China in the modern era. To understand China, you have to grapple with the BRI. Many analysts view the project as China's answer to the Marshall Plan, a post-World War II economic assistance package that sought to revitalize war-torn Europe. Unlike the Marshall Plan, the BRI is extended to any willing economic partner. Formal agreements between China, the host nation, to build economic and political ties generally precede a litany of Chinese investment, funding, infrastructure projects, tech collaboration, and more. In the process, China gets access to ports, and airfields, markets for state-owned companies, safeguards for international trade, and international influence. For years, the BRI has been the litmus test for global Chinese power projection. The belt connects China with Europe and the other dozen nations on its borders via a series of overland trade routes, while the road refers to its maritime interests, fueling stations, ports, industry, infrastructure scattered throughout Southeast Asia and the Indian Ocean. A great example of periphery diplomacy, BRI projects can now be found from the Himalayas to the Horn of Africa and Mediterranean basin. It has funded infrastructure deals in Malaysia, gas pipelines and railroads in Nigeria, Egypt, Ethiopia and Kenya, maintains port operations in Greece, projects in Sri Lanka, and has other projects in the works. The West has viewed the BRI warily. Some criticize China's debt trap diplomacy, a tactic of luring economically vulnerable states into taking out Chinese loans and then jacking up the rates to unpayable levels as a form of coercion over the government in question. Others fear China's growing telecommunications and economic influence over Europe and the global South, but there still hasn't been a really unified response, and China continues to shovel money into its initiative, with another $124 billion pledged in 2017. One of the big warning signs came that same year, when China decided to establish a hub in Djibouti, a developing nation strategically located in the Gulf of Aden on the Horn of Africa. China had essentially said it would never open an official military base there, and then they did, calling it a logistics facility, even though PLA Navy Marines and other forces regularly mull about with armored vehicles and artillery. It is considering similar projects in Cambodia, Myanmar, Thailand, Singapore, Indonesia, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, United Arab Emirates, Kenya, Seychelles, Tanzania, Angola, and Tajikistan, evidence of China's expanding military footprint around the globe. These military bases hold great potential for regional destabilization. Such developments are a warning that countries can become unwitting partners to PRC military expansion by giving China access to airfields and ports it would otherwise lack. A global footprint, therefore, is a prerequisite for China's national rejuvenation and has certainly empowered its actions at home. Maritime disputes in the waters around China are so common they've almost become normalized. These waters in the South China Sea are heavily trafficked, including some of the richest shipping lanes in the world. Xi Jinping made a promise not to militarize certain islands China artificially built in the South China Sea. Now the Parcel and Spratly Islands are militarized and can be used to intimidate and coerce coastal states throughout the region. The bullying continues in the East China Sea as Chinese merchant vessels regularly dominate lucrative shipping lanes. Coast Guard, military, and commercial ships deprive foreign fishermen of access to resources, and policymakers make ambitious maritime claims that are frequently rejected as lacking basis in international law. For the record, territorial waters are considered up to 12 nautical miles off a country's coastline, a fact China ignores. China wants to monopolize the natural gas, oil, and hydrocarbon reserves it feels it has a claim to, even hundreds of miles away. A lot of the tension arises near the Senkaku Islands, a group of uninhabited islands that in 1971 reverted back to Japanese administrative control under the Okinawa Reversion Agreement. Over these seas, China has set out to create air defense identification zones, increasing its operational reach even further. Taken together, China's economic and cultural influence combined with its renewed military strength add up into a scary equation for Beijing's neighbors. There have also been regular border conflicts on the China-India frontier since a PRC-instigated clash in 2020 left dozens dead. India claims China has the onus to withdraw. They haven't. South Korea is worried about North Korea, China's only major Asian ally, doing something stupid. Even Japan, those guys who were so committed to pacifism after World War II that they called their military a self-defense force, are now so alarmed they're arming themselves with hundreds of Tomahawk missiles, writing counter-strike capabilities into their fighting doctrine, and conducting joint military exercises with American and Australian forces, an image that surely would have made our grandparents both proud and perplexed. And nobody should be more scared than Taiwan. The small independent island nation will almost undoubtedly be ground zero in any World War III scenario with China. Here's why. China is bent on reuniting Taiwan with mainland China. The spat goes back to World War II, when nationalist rebels fled to the island and created a vibrant democratic society, one China refuses to acknowledge or respect. Ever since, China has wanted Taiwan back more than a prepubescent teen who accidentally traded their holographic first edition Charizard for a bag of potato chips. And this is a problem, since the United States has all but formally pledged to intervene and protect Taiwan in the event China decides to invade. And boy, has it probably thought about it. In August 2022, the China State Council produced a white paper whose table of contents made China's position on the issue explicitly clear. Chapter 1. Taiwan is part of China. This is an indisputable fact. Chapter 2. Resolute efforts of the CCP to realize China's complete reunification. Chapter 3. China's complete reunification is a process that cannot be halted. Chapter 4. National reunification in a new era. Chapter 5. Bright prospects for a peaceful reunification. It's okay, you can tell us how you really feel, Beijing. We are one China, the paper alleges, and Taiwan is part of China. This is an indisputable fact supported by history and the law. Taiwan has never been a state. Its status as part of China is unalterable. The CPC is committed to the historic mission of resolving the Taiwan question and realizing China's complete reunification. So China is overwhelmingly focused on reunifying Taiwan. They say they won't use force. Where have we heard that before? Authoritarian leader claims he won't use force to reunify territory he believes is rightfully his. But hey, this type of tension has been brewing since the 1996 Taiwan Strait crisis, when the PRC had a showdown with an American carrier group after conducting a bunch of missile tests in the Taiwan Strait. The outcome of the Taiwan issue has real global bearings. Taiwan is the epicenter of the global semiconductor industry. What's a semiconductor, you say? Anything that has an electronic chip. Your phone, your computer, your wireless modem, your electronic toys, your average ballistic missile, medical instruments, televisions, cutting-edge satellites, they all rely on semiconductors for computing. It is a $556 billion industry, one that for better or for worse hinges on the whims of a Taiwan-China-US love triangle. You see, the US sells 46% of global semiconductors, but only manufactures 12% of them. China consumes the most, importing $378 billion worth and putting what it buys into 35% of the world's devices. And Taiwan, as you might expect, has 53% of the global semiconductor market share and produces 90% of the world's most advanced ones you might see in cars, smartphones, and military tech. That's a serious share of the market. Interdependence is a problem. The US is now trying to decouple itself from the Taipei-Beijing chip drama and become self-sufficient. But Taiwan's predominance on the global chip market is one reason Beijing literally cannot afford to let Taiwan continue to independently exist. It needs to set the terms of trade in the region, not Taiwan and other Western-facing nations. Otherwise, it will always be seen as a second-rate power. What does this all amount to? Well, this situation has produced the worst security crisis in the Taiwan Strait in 20 years. China means business. As Taiwan becomes more eager to carve out its independence from the mainland, China views its very sovereign existence as an existential threat. China worries about being hamstrung behind the first island chain, a series of nations that includes the Philippines, Borneo, Japan, and the Ryukyu Islands, that it fears can contain and limit its ability to project power beyond its shores. Taiwan is at the heart of this island chain, a cornerstone of Western power in the region, one that perpetually transmits dangerously subversive messages of Western-backed prosperity while it remains independent. With Taiwan under America's orbit, it is a thorn in Xi's side. With a reunified Taiwan, China gains the ability to break the first island chain and wield influence deep into the Pacific. Predictably, China is throwing caution to the wind regarding Taiwan's territorial sovereignty, violating Taiwan's Air Defense Identification Zone, ADIZ, and the median line dividing the Taiwan Strait, once considered as an invisible barrier between the two entities with frightful regularity. Between 1954 and 2020, there were only 4 Chinese violations of these internationally recognized demarcations. In 2020 alone, there were 380. There were more than double that number the following year with 969 incursions. The biggest came on October 4th, 2021, a day that saw 56 aircraft enter Taiwan's air defense zone, unironically coinciding with China's National Day of celebration. By May of this year, there had been a 50% increase in the number of incursions over the same span in 2021. Partially to send a supportive signal in response, the US conducted a series of high-profile political visits to the island. China didn't buy it. To them, the visits were needlessly escalatory. They responded with more overflights, setting a new record for monthly sorties. Since the summer, the PLA Air Force, PLAF, has flown over 1,000 sorties near Taiwan, 40% of them in the ADIZ or over the median line. Today, it is coming into Taiwanese airspace on a near-daily basis, ramping up its intimidation efforts around Taiwan in other ways too, from anti-submarine warfare, drone reconnaissance, and cyber attacks to the growth of its naval and missile presence in the region. China's end goal is clear. Taiwan has voiced alarm and concern over the near-constant encirclement drills, labeling them as escalatory, equivalent of a sea and air blockade of the island. If these are, in fact, dress rehearsals for a full-scale invasion, China will continue to ramp up the pressure as the time goes on. The on-ramp to war, then, is there, and it's volatile. Some pundits compare the existing slate of geopolitical relationships in the Indo-Pacific to the entangled alliance systems in Europe on the eve of World War I. This is, at least, a line of reasoning Hal Brands, a prominent political scientist at Johns Hopkins University, has espoused, comparing Japanese, Australian, and American collaboration as a latter-day triple entente, the pre-World War coalition that sought to contain Imperial Germany in the Western Pacific. It didn't take much for the World War I powder keg to erupt in the Balkans, fueling a chain reaction that resulted in the First World War. If history is any guide, it won't take much to escalate a regional clash in the Indo-Pacific into a global war either. It is here in Asia's maritime heartland where all the ingredients of a global cataclysm are conspiring against the post-Cold War period of peace and stability in the Indo-Pacific. One analyst observed, "It's also here where the naked edge of China's hegemonic ambitions are on full display, with dire consequences for smaller neighbors and the broader liberal international order. Here lies the defining geopolitical dilemma of our times." Well put. So how are the major players gearing up to play their part? We've already talked about China, at least their geopolitical maneuvering. Militarily, they've been following the same path, modernizing at an impressive rate to add bite to their bark as they pursue their strategy of recasting the global governance system in its own image. Its to-do list has, so far, taken a page right out of America's playbook. China has adopted the model that made America powerful, first building a moderately prosperous society in all respects, then using that as a foundation to build a truly competitive, world-class military. The fusion of civil-military power is deliberate. Industrial developments in quantum computing, AI, robotics, and biotechnology not only help China become competitive in the civilian sphere, these technologies can be appropriated to help the Chinese network their military forces. And make no mistake, this is something it is eagerly doing. To create a state-of-the-art air force, it has set a goal to fully network its combined and joint chains of command by 2027. Advancing dual-use technologies, ones that can benefit civilian and military infrastructure alike, will enable rapid information exchange between its army, navy, air, rocket, and yes, even space forces. Easily setting the Chinese military apart from anything America's nearest peer, the Russians have been able to achieve in Ukraine if they succeed. For a while now, the CCP has portrayed a West in relative decline. This narrative fuels Beijing's hopes it can supplant the United States as the preeminent global superpower. And to be fair, things in the United States haven't been all that peachy over the past decade or so. Race riots, populism, rampant misinformation and fake news, capital uprisings, COVID, political polarization, mistrust, and fear have exposed internal fractures and brought American democracy to its weakest point in generations. But America has been gearing up for its marathon clash against China for years now, in the hopes that if things did spill over into a full-scale war, it would be ready. American leaders, regardless of political party, are now mostly unified on this. They know the coming struggle will be ideological and cultural as much as it will be an in-and-out technological, economic, and military competition. Still, it wasn't really until 2018 that the United States officially changed its strategic posture to address China's rise. At the tail end of two fruitless decades in the Middle East, its national strategy shifted to recognize China, not terrorists or Russia, as the main peer adversary. This year, the Biden administration updated its national security strategy but did not depart from the rhetoric or strategic competition that pervaded earlier iterations. American strategy emphasizes this as the decisive decade, to get ahead and win the competition for the 21st century. Some people criticize American strategy for reviving antiquated Cold War mentalities, painting over Soviet tropes with Chinese skins in another zero-sum adversarial competition that could needlessly escalate into war. Vastly different political systems aside, there are more similarities than differences between China and the United States than there were between the US and the Soviet Union, especially in the realm of economics. The two competing powers are not mutually exclusive, but disagreements and mistrust are common enough destabilizers that many fear the status quo can't be maintained for long. China is aware that it still cannot compete with the United States in many areas. The United States Navy, for instance, though technically smaller than the Chinese Navy, continues to patrol strategic waterways in the Indo-Pacific, ensuring vital sea lanes remain open for free and flourishing international trade. American carrier groups have bases throughout the first island chain. American submarines and aircraft tend to be more robust, possessing longer range and better stealth technology than their Chinese counterparts. Chinese jet engines are not as advanced as American ones. Its military suffers quality control issues with its imbalanced admixture of antiquated and modern military systems and vehicles. Its logistics and transport capabilities lag far behind their globe-trotting American adversary. And above all, the Chinese lack concrete fighting experience, having fought and lost their last major operation in Vietnam in 1979. Experience the United States coming off its own unfortunate Middle Eastern odyssey nevertheless has in spades. But the PLA's military strategy is catered to overcome these shortcomings. In a World War III scenario, especially one involving Taiwan, the United States, its allies and partners, namely Japan, South Korea, Singapore, the Philippines, and possibly India, would have to operate in China's neck of the woods at the tail end of an incredibly long logistics network. The United States' geographic location makes it reliant on small overseas bases, refueling tankers, transport vehicles, and carriers to convey and sustain its units abroad. While China continues modernizing its forces and develops its own expeditionary capabilities, it has developed an anti-access area denial (A2AD) strategy to keep America and its allies at bay in the Indo-Pacific. The strategy has seen China prioritize the construction of a bristling array of ground-based missiles, naval assets, and aircraft equipped with the latest air-to-air and air-to-ground missiles that can outrange their American counterparts, and thus discourage them from intervening in a regional conflict. This active defense strategy will make American intervention in Taiwan both risky and potentially deadly. Is all of this really leading to a future world war? Most security experts will be the first to tell you that the war against China is anything but inevitable. If both powers can learn to manage their competitive relationship, they can peacefully coexist despite their adversarial posture. But wars can ignite from inauspicious sources. As Peter Warren Singer, a strategist and senior fellow at a think tank called New America and award-winning author, has written, in the coming decades, a war might ignite accidentally, such as by two opposing warships trading paint near a reef not even marked on a nautical chart, or it could slow burn and erupt as a reordering of the global system in the late 2020s, a period at which China's military buildup is on pace to match the US. Singer has spent a lot of time thinking about the type of war we might expect in the Pacific. The war, he argues, will be a multi-domain conflict, meaning it will transpire in the traditional domains of air, sea, and land, as well as futuristic domains like space, the lifeblood of modern military communications, and cyber, where digital military systems and civilian infrastructure may be prone to attack. The United States has not waged a multi-domain war against a peer adversary since 1945, and so many of the lessons it learned in Iraq and Afghanistan may not be as relevant to a war with China. Likewise, America's traditional approach to wars has been to overmatch its enemies, relying on military technology at least one generation ahead to produce qualitative advantages on the battlefield. US forces can't count on overmatch in the future, Singer argues, since much of America's intellectual property has been stolen outright by Chinese spies, while its R&D has been accelerating its experimentation with space, drone, hypersonic, and cyber technologies. Still, experimentation is not the same as full-scale acquisition and implementation. China's two biggest vulnerabilities are historically significant: that it is reliant on imported semiconductors and microchips, things it cannot produce itself, and second, that it is heavily reliant on imported oil. The situation is not unlike Japan's in the early 20th century, a rapidly modernizing imperial power with a plucky navy totally reliant on oil imports to sustain itself. As it started to expand into China and the Pacific, seeking access to raw resources, the United States embarked the export of oil and other military goods. Pearl Harbor, the start of the last war for the United States fought in the Pacific, came in part because Japanese leaders viewed the war with the United States as inevitable. It needed an independent oil supply, something it would seek in the oil-rich Dutch East Indies, and it knew if it attacked, the US would come knocking, so it needed to prevent its own geopolitical encirclement by striking a knockout blow on the American fleet, then stationed at Pearl Harbor. It had a narrow window, given its limited oil reserves at home, and so they attacked. Some say another Pearl Harbor is brewing, this time with Taiwan at the epicenter. Reunifying the island by force will give China access to the semiconductors it needs, but it would have to ensure that the United States could not meaningfully intervene. Toshi Yoshihara, a China expert who works at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessment, has warned that the PLA's views on a Pacific conflict are consistent with Pearl Harbor, and that they are predisposed to delivering a decisive first blow against US deployed forces in the Western Pacific, particularly those in Japan. Chinese doctrine indeed emphasizes surprise at the outset of war, all part of a counter-intervention strategy to keep the Beijing, Tianjin, Shanghai, Nanjing, Guangzhou, Shenzhen corridor open. Its precision strike arsenal, primarily made up of DF-21C missiles, are capable of hitting any target on the entire Japanese archipelago, while its DF-26 missiles can fire conventional and nuclear warheads almost 4,000 kilometers, far enough to strike the strategic US base at Guam. In all likelihood, if it were to spring an amphibious invasion of Taiwan, China's tactic would be to saturate America's roving carrier groups and their escorts with waves of ballistic anti-ship missiles, overcome their defenses, and send billions of dollars of valuable equipment to the bottom of the ocean before it can be brought to bear. This would help overcome the early gulf in military shipping, aircraft, and tonnage between the two sides. They would then target vulnerable American sensor aircraft, refueling tankers, and cargo ships to curtail America's ability to get close to Chinese territory. The United States has far more battle force missiles than the Chinese, meaning the total number of missiles capable of being fired in combat before resupply, but the Chinese do have enough to saturate and destroy 3 American carrier groups simultaneously, potentially turning the American naval forces in the Pacific into a moot point before a war begins. There is even evidence that they have been practicing such preemptive strikes in the Gobi Desert in western China. Such a move might be good in the short term, but short-term tactical victories do not win wars. China would then have to contend with the galvanization of American morale, the mobilization of its entire economy for war, and the possibility of intervention from many of its regional and global partners, one of whom is Japan, the world's 3rd largest economy with a powerful navy of its own. If China went to war, it would be anything but subtle. For an operation that big in the 21st century, it's almost impossible to achieve the element of surprise. Observers would see a flurry of activity in China's eastern and southern theater commands opposite Taiwan for weeks and even months prior to invasion. Ports of embarkation, airfields, field hospitals, and mobile command posts buzzing, units deploying with oil and gas pipelines, transport ships loading, commercial ships looking to provoke and escalate. The forces far from Taiwan would be placed on high alert. National mobilization efforts would increase, and the military would begin commandeering civilian vessels, ferries, aircrafts, trucks, and trains. China would have to surge its production of ballistic long-range missiles and cruise missiles for a massive anti-air, anti-ship, air-to-air, and beach bombardment. It would need to achieve a degree of economic self-sufficiency in anticipation for the sanctions that would undoubtedly be implemented. It would be a lot like what we saw in Ukraine with Russian forces massing on the border, not unlike a classic game of Risk. You mass on your enemy's border, you claim you come in peace, you are only there to defend yourself, you claim. Meanwhile, battle plans are circulating, and you are one move away from starting World War III. What's next? Unlike the Japanese at Pearl Harbor, who failed to authorize a 3rd strike to neutralize the American carrier and submarine fleet, the Chinese would have to find a way to continually pressure the Americans in the Pacific to deter further intervention. Making it so prohibitively costly, its morale and will to assist Taiwan would crumble. An invasion of Taiwan would be tantamount to Germany's invasion of the Rhineland in 1936. Unless the West is willing to stand up and deter Chinese aggression from the start, an invasion could spark emergency rearmament programs, mass mobilization, and quickly escalate into a global war. Xi and the CCP are no fools, however. They know it would be a Rubicon moment if they were to invade Taiwan, something they could never walk back from. They will have been watching Putin's adventure in Ukraine with great interest, observing firsthand how aggressive regional land grabs can spiral into an out-and-out, no-holds-barred contest against deceptively capable nations with Western backing. They know if they act, they will immediately forfeit their national image abroad and become international pariahs. In the end, China will have to figure out what ultimate victory would look like, and if it will be worth the price of an all-out war. The ball is already in their court. Reunifying Taiwan by force is a massive obstacle. Overturning an entire global order is even harder by an order of magnitude. Could China do it? Is war really inevitable? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more military analysis from military experts. If the nightmare scenario of World War III were to become reality, where would the hostilities break out? Could it come near the shores of the Baltic Sea, with Russia trying to regain some of its prestige in the region after an embarrassing performance in Ukraine? Could it be in the Middle East, with a renewed Iranian nuclear program? Or perhaps it could come from renewed hostilities on the Korean peninsula, which is still technically in a state of war. Or maybe China decides to risk everything on an invasion of Taiwan. These are all potential hotspots, but the likeliest one could be in the South China Sea, where China has expanded its military presence for a decade and alienated all of its neighbors in the region, who also claim these waters and their islands. Could World War III break out in the South China Sea? If so, why? Let's take a look at the importance of this region, the basis of China's territorial ambitions in it, and how likely a confrontation might actually be. The South China Sea, which stretches from the Strait of Malacca in the west to the Strait of Taiwan in the east, is a rich target for any would-be great power to exploit. It is abundant in resources. There are at least 11 billion barrels of oil and 190 trillion cubic feet of natural gas in these islands and waterways. The South China Sea is also home to some of the world's richest fisheries, providing about 15% of the world's total fishing potential. Rare earth metals such as yttrium, which are so vital to the modern digital economy, can also be found in the South China Sea. In addition to its natural resources, the area is one of the most vital crossroads of world trade. As of 2021, about $5.3 trillion, about 22% of annual global trade, pass through the South China Sea's shipping lanes, including 40% of the world's petroleum products, 60% of its maritime trade, and a third of the world's total shipping. Some of the world's biggest economies depend on this trade too. For example, 42% of Japan's total trade comes through this region. This is a rich prize for any aspiring superpower. When considering why China wants the South China Sea so badly, it is also important to note that it is a food-insecure nation. It depends heavily on foreign food imports. In 2017, China imported $104.5 billion worth of food and exported only about $60 billion. In terms of grain production, Chinese agriculture has achieved a 1-to-1 production to consumption ratio. However, it lags behind its rivals like the United States and Australia, which produce 1.4 times more grain than they consume. Additionally, China's economic growth has created a large middle class, with more sophisticated food demands, such as meat and dairy, which are more resource-intensive. It needs to import from foreign sources to fulfill the demands of its population. It does not help that China has a relatively low amount of arable land at 0.21 acres per capita. Environmental damage from decades of communist mismanagement makes matters worse. 15.5% of China's groundwater is so polluted that it cannot be used in any setting, and widespread soil contamination has destroyed millions of acres of otherwise arable land, especially in the country's southern provinces. Meanwhile, over 1 million Chinese hogs were slaughtered to contain the spread of African swine fever, and domestic pork production fell by 21.3% in 2019. Meanwhile, pork imports from the United States increased by 258%. To make matters worse for Beijing, even though China is the world's largest producer and exporter of fish, it is also still the world's third largest fish importer, and Chinese fisheries have been stressed by overfishing. In 2013, the Chinese leadership acknowledged that the country would require moderate imports of food to meet its consumption needs. In this light, it is not surprising that China would want to increase its food security. Seizing the fisheries in the South China Sea is only the most obvious method of expansion of its food production capacity. Controlling the shipping that is so vital to its food supply is a no-brainer for Beijing. China also became the world's biggest energy consumer in 2010. In 2013, China became the world's largest net importer of crude oil, and its energy demands have only grown in the decade since. It must remain able to access the South China Sea's shipping lanes to ensure this energy supply. Bottom line, whoever controls the South China Sea also controls its resources and the economies of the nations that rely on the shipping that goes through its waters. It is therefore not surprising that China made moves to expand its influence in the region when its military became more capable. How has China justified these moves? Beijing cites historical reasons. Its modern claims on 90% of the South China Sea's waterways are based on the so-called 9-dash line map. The map originated in 1947 when, in the aftermath of World War II, a Chinese cartographer named Yang Huairen drew a map of 11 dashes, which extended from the waters east of Taiwan through the South China Sea almost to Malaysia and up the Vietnamese coastline all the way to the Gulf of Tonkin. This map was drawn under the nationalist government which ruled the then Republic of China. 2 years later, the Communist Party of China, led by Mao Zedong, overthrew the nationalists and took control of the Chinese mainland. Mao subsequently redrew the map to 9 dashes and abandoned the claim on the Gulf of Tonkin, but the basic scheme remained intact. China tries to justify the 9-dash line's legitimacy on historical grounds. It claims that it was the great power in the area and had run the waters before it suffered from unjust imperialism at the hands of the Western powers and Japan in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Records of Chinese control and development of the Spratly Islands in particular supposedly stretch back to the 2nd century BC. More concrete Chinese claims come from the Cairo and Potsdam declarations during and after World War II. These supposedly had China reclaiming sovereignty in the South China Sea's islands. The formal peace treaty with Japan in 1951 and the San Francisco Conference Statement in 1958 also had China reiterating that the South China Sea territory was its own. However, these claims were and are regarded as unfounded by the international community. The dispute in the South China Sea therefore gives credence to the realist theory of international relations, where self-interested states compete with one another in an anarchical environment. China's claim on the area are unrecognized, so it is asserting itself by force and daring anyone to try and stop its ambitions. After all, there is no policeman to call on in an international setting and no court of law with any real power beyond what states themselves give it, as we will soon see. The 11 and 9-dash line maps were of little consequence in the first few decades after they were drawn. China had suffered from nearly 150 years of invasion, civil war, and the famines and purges Mao imposed with the Great Leap Forward and Cultural Revolution. China was therefore in no position to enforce the claims of its 9-dash line. However, Beijing indicated early on that it was willing to use force to back up its otherwise spurious claims. In 1974, China seized control of the Paracel Islands from the then existing country of South Vietnam, killing more than 70 South Vietnamese troops in the process. The following year, the Vietnam War ended, and the country reunified under the North's rule, and the North inherited the claim to the Paracels, which it disputes with China to this day. The Paracels are relatively close to the Hainan Island, which is officially recognized Chinese territory. But as China got economically and militarily stronger after Mao's death in 1976, it got bolder in enforcing its claims further afield. In 1988, China and Vietnam fought in the Spratlys, and Vietnam again got the worst of the engagement, suffering the loss of 60 sailors and 3 ships. China also fought with the Philippines in the Mischief Reef incident of 1996, where 3 ships from the Chinese Navy fought a 90-minute battle with a Filipino gunboat in the Spratly Islands. However, China's modern posture in the South China Sea dates to 2012, when it unilaterally seized control of the Scarborough Shoal, a territory in the Philippines recognized exclusive economic zone. Standoffs and warning shots between China and the Philippines had occurred in 2011, but the situation escalated dramatically in April 2012. On the 8th, a Filipino Navy surveillance plane spotted 8 Chinese fishing boats in the Scarborough Shoal. On the 11th, the Filipino Navy had a standoff with China's Navy. China eventually won this contest when, on July 18th, it blocked Filipino ships and fishing boats from entering the Scarborough Shoals lagoon. It has effectively administered the area ever since. The Philippines took China to the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague in 2013, and in 2016, the court ruled in the former's favor, dismissing any claim that China had over the territory in the South China Sea and invalidating the 9-dash line entirely. Did this stop China from advancing its claims in the area? You know the answer to that. Beijing's attitude was that the court made its ruling, good luck in enforcing it. China not only disregarded the international court's ruling, but it accelerated its plans to dominate the South China Sea. From 2013 to 15, it began building artificial islands in its positions in the Spratly Islands. It soon began militarizing these areas. In March 2022, US Indo-Pacific Commander Admiral John C. Aquilino announced that China had fully militarized at least 3 of the islands it had built several years earlier. These islands were Fiery Cross Reef, Mischief Reef, and Subi Reef. The new fortresses boasted airfields with fighter jets and which were even capable of hosting bombers. The islands also housed anti-ship and anti-aircraft missile systems. Laser and jamming equipment were also features in these islands. The military buildup came partially in response to the United States Freedom of Navigation Operations (FONOPs) in the area. These operations and China's response to them pose one of the biggest risks for war. In 2022, Aquilino was in the thick of the action. He spoke with the Associated Press reporters on a US Navy reconnaissance plane, a P-8A Poseidon, that flew close to the Chinese island fortresses. Chinese military personnel contacted the plane and warned it to leave. China has sovereignty over the Spratly Islands, as well as surrounding maritime areas. Stay away immediately to avoid misjudgment. The American pilot responded like so: "I am a sovereign, immune United States naval aircraft conducting lawful military activities beyond the national airspace of any coastal state. Exercising these rights is guaranteed by international law, and I am operating with due regard to the rights and duties of all states." The implication was obvious. China claims that the islands it built are its territory and that it has the right to defend them. The United States says that they are not, and proceed under the assumption that they are not. Maintaining freedom of trade and navigation on the world's waterways has long been one of the United States military's primary missions. To maintain freedom of navigation in the South China Sea, and deter China from growing even more aggressive there, the United States has conducted its FONOPs since 2015. These operations can take one of two forms. In the first form, they may simply be transit exercises. In the second, they may be explicit military exercises. The United States does not notify or seek China's approval when it conducts these operations within its supposed 9-line territory. In other words, the FONOPs are a direct challenge to China's claimed sovereignty in the South China Sea, showing that the United States regards these claims as nothing more than illegitimate bluster on the part of Beijing. This is a game of brinksmanship. Who will blink first? So far, it's been China, but there is no guarantee that that will continue forever. In its first FONOP on October 27, 2015, the destroyer USS Lassen came within 12 nautical miles of features in the Spratly Islands claimed by China, Vietnam, Taiwan, and the Philippines. Although the FONOP was technically designed to counter all of these expansive territorial claims, everybody understood who the real recipient of the message was supposed to be. Similar operations have taken place since then, and they have increased as the years have gone by. The Chinese Navy soon challenged America's FONOPs, and there have been numerous close calls. In 2018, there was a near collision between a US Navy destroyer and a Chinese warship when the latter tried to block the American vessel's path. This close call was avoided, but Chinese naval ships have become more aggressive in tailing and disputing the US Navy as it sails past what they claim are Chinese territorial waters and islands. The risk for escalation increases when one considers that ship captains have a relatively high degree of autonomy. For example, equipment failure might make a captain feel like his vessel is under threat. Faulty communications, equipment, or radars could present an incomplete picture of events, giving the ship's captain what he believes are limited options to protect the vessel and its crew. In such confusion, human nature tends to default to assuming the worst. There is precedent for a close call between the US and Chinese armed forces. In April 2001, an American reconnaissance plane collided with a Chinese fighter and was forced to make an emergency landing on Hainan Island. China detained the plane's crew for 11 days as Washington and Beijing blamed each other for the incident and disagreed over the terms of a resolution. Both sides tried to be accommodating, and the incident was resolved without too much controversy in the end, to the point that it's nearly forgotten today. If a similar incident occurred now, the story could be very different. Understandably, this prospect makes military and foreign policy experts nervous. Some have called for an end to the US military's FONOPs in the South China Sea, arguing that they have failed and that the risks exceed the benefits. They argue that the cost of upholding international norms through military means has increased to a level that is too high, and that the American public would not be willing to pay. Instead, these experts argue that the United States should use economic leverage to force China to change its behavior. There is recent precedent for this. In 2020, the United States Commerce Department sanctioned 24 Chinese companies for their behavior in the South China Sea, prohibiting the sale of certain exported goods. The State Department joined in the effort and announced that individuals in those companies would also be prohibited from obtaining visas to enter the United States. However, there are severe limits to this approach. Most of the companies in question did not source any of their materials from the United States, and the visa restrictions are altogether toothless. It's hard to conclude that completely ceding the military realm in the South China Sea to China's much less capable neighbors will encourage Beijing to alter its expansionist policy in the region. To add to these diplomatic and military tensions, there are also matters of national and cultural pride among the South China Sea's disputants. The 9-line has become a matter of national pride among the Chinese public over the last decade. To them, it is a sign that the period of humiliation, poverty, and revolution are over, and that China is at last retaking its rightful place at the hegemon of Asia. For China's neighbors, the issue is similarly sensitive. In the summer of 2023, Vietnam banned Barbie from its movie theaters over a scene with a map in the background that supposedly depicted China's 9-line. Vietnam and the Philippines banned the movie Uncharted in 2022 for the same reason. Vietnam, the Philippines, and Malaysia banned the 2019 movie Abominable, again for the same reason. For these countries, which also claim the South China Sea but do not have the military means to back up their assertions, sensitivity about their disadvantage is naturally elevated. With national pride on the line, there are additional emotional stakes, in the South China Sea conflict. The United States, which is approaching the dispute from strategic and economic perspectives, will need to take such cultural considerations into account as it makes its policy there to counter China's hegemonic ambitions. The United States is keen to make alliances with other countries in the area to prevent China from taking control of the South China Sea's shipping lanes. This strategy began with the reinvigoration of the quadrilateral security dialogue during the Trump years. The United States and its Quad partners, Australia, Japan, and India, committed to maintaining a free and open Indo-Pacific. China has repeatedly protested the Quad and considers it a threat. Meanwhile, the United States has renewed its long-standing military ties with the Philippines and is building new army, air, and naval bases in that country. This is bad news for China, which was hoping to court the Philippines into its orbit. Despite the bitter South China Sea dispute, Rodrigo Duterte, who was president of the Philippines from 2016 to 22, maintained a friendlier policy toward China, in hopes of making his country less dependent on the United States. His successor, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., has reversed this policy and allowed the US military a greater presence in the Philippines. The United States has also been steadily improving its bilateral relations with Vietnam. Although there are no formal military ties between the two countries yet, that could change in the future as China continues to get more aggressive with its claims in the area. The United States has not taken the side of the Philippines, Taiwan, Malaysia, Vietnam, or any other power in the area with excessive maritime claims. Indeed, it does not support any of these and seeks to maintain freedom of navigation in the area. However, none of these countries have the ability to shut such navigation down. China does, and containing its ambitions in the South China Sea is the common interest that they all share. In possibly the most famous part of his History of the Peloponnesian War, the Melian Dialogue, the Athenians told the city of Melos that they had two choices: submit or suffer the consequences. In contrast to the Melians' talk about what would amount to international law today, the Athenians responded only that they had an interest in Melos and would be acting accordingly. The strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must. We have seen this ancient dynamic in play in the South China Sea, with China acting in a similar manner, with China unlikely to change its behavior anytime soon, and with the economic, geostrategic, and cultural stakes involved, it's far from a stretch to think that war could break out in this region. Perhaps an American FONOP goes very wrong, or perhaps China uses its bases in the region to launch a much greater offensive in disputed territories. However it happens, the consequences would be catastrophic, and an accident here is much more likely than an accident over Taiwan. But what do you think about the South China Sea dispute? Is it the place where World War III is likeliest to break out? Is there a way to resolve the matter peacefully? Don't forget to let us know in the comments. Hit the like button and subscribe for more military analysis from military experts. What do Ukraine and China have in common? Let's start with geopolitical significance. Both China and Ukraine hold strategic geopolitical importance. China is the world's most populous country, with a population of approximately 1,426,000,000 in 2023, and the second largest economy, preceded by the US. Ukraine, on the other hand, is the second largest country in Europe by land area, with a total area of approximately 232,900 square miles. This means that the second largest country in Europe is roughly 28 times smaller than Europe's largest country, Russia, which spans an area of roughly 6,606,000 square miles. Then there's the fact that both China and Ukraine are connected through China's Belt and Road Initiative, or BRI, making Ukraine an important transit country for the BRI's land-based routes, and thus linking China with Europe. However, lately, a new and deeply disturbing commonality has arisen between both countries: Putin's war on Ukraine. And as bad as it's been for Ukraine itself, it has also been downright disastrous for China. But why? In what way? Let's find out. In today's world, it pays to have friends in high places. Fortunately for the Western world, and especially Ukraine, Russia has virtually none of them. China, however, is among the few. The two neighbor nations are strategic partners, linked economically by $190 billion of annual trade, and politically by virtue of their authoritarian, like-minded leaders. Over the past decades, the two countries have forged closer bilateral ties. Both sides, moreover, view the United States as a hostile actor bent on containing their territorial and cultural ambitions. On the surface, they're like two geopolitical peas in a pod. But all is not as rosy as it seems. Once aspirational partners of Western democracies content, even keen to assimilate these two Eurasian powers into their economic, cultural, and political spheres, Putin's invasion of Ukraine has changed everything. Russia's once vaunted military has, in many circles, become a laughingstock, and this has reflected poorly on China, whose own extraterritorial designs on its neighbors are well known throughout the world. Most peace-loving nations today view both as a threat, though certainly not on equal levels. One US official perhaps summarized it best: Russia is a hurricane. It comes on hard and fast. China, on the other hand, is climate change. Long, slow, pervasive. Today, China continues to foster close relations with Putin, even though the Russian president headlines the International Criminal Court's arrest warrant list. It's a bad look. But the PRC isn't willing to throw the Kremlin out with the bathwater just yet. Today, we'll discuss why they might want to reconsider that decision, and just how Russia's reverses in Ukraine may influence China's strategic calculus moving forward. Putin's illegal war has been an eye-opening experience for the world. China, as we all know, harbors territorial claims on Taiwan, its independent island neighbor. As such, the United States, Taiwan, and the vast majority of the civilized world place China's ambitions in the same category as Putin's toward Ukraine. Ever since Russian forces stormed across the border in February 2022, the United States and its allies kept a closer eye on China. If the Ukrainian invasion went as well as many thought it would be fair to assume China might feel empowered to attack Taiwan, especially as Europe and the US were distracted by Russia. We can safely say now, over a year in, and knowing what he knows about the complexities of modern joint and combined arms warfare, Xi would have to be stupid to authorize an unprovoked amphibious invasion of Taiwan. So far, there's only one dictator dumb enough to do that, and look how that's going. With each passing day, the PRC is witnessing Russia sink unfathomable amounts of blood and treasure into an almost unwinnable war of attrition. In the wreckage of Bakhmut, the atrocities of Bucha, and the discontent growing in the hearts of babushkas far and wide, China's leadership sees its future plans of easily seizing Taiwan slipping away. War is a hard teacher. For now, China may be content to sit back and learn all it can, while it can. Why then has Putin's invasion become a disaster for China's future plans? Let's dive in. No matter how you cut it, almost every lesson in Ukraine spells bad news for China. So far, China has adopted a unique, long-term, over-the-horizon strategic approach in its posture towards Taiwan. Its primary tactic has not been as in-your-face as you would expect from a rising superpower accustomed to throwing its economic and cultural weight around. But militarily, China has adapted something called gray zone operations to achieve its strategic ends. Gray zone operations are just like they sound, actions on the spectrum between peace and war. These small, compounding confrontations are not designed to escalate into a full-scale war, but they certainly can. They tend to be employed by powerful actors bent on achieving objectives that ordinarily might be illegal or too difficult to do all at once, and often take a variety of forms. These can include cyber attacks or covert espionage, political propaganda and misinformation campaigns, election rigging, economic warfare and sanctions, proxy wars, and the funding of destabilizing insurgencies, or the gradual weakening of alliances and partnerships. One of China's preferred tactics is to slowly increase the number of times it flies into Taiwan's Air Defense Identification Zone, the internationally recognized airspace around the island, until it almost becomes normal. Along with this, China has recently sent more and more vessels up to and even over the Taiwan Strait median line, demarcating the boundary between both countries. It has deployed men and material onto smaller island chains, man-made and otherwise, in the South China Sea to intimidate and pressure their neighbor. It harasses foreign vessels traversing these waters too, as a Chinese naval vessel recently did to a Philippine Coast Guard patrol just 105 miles off its own coastline. Grey zone operations take place independent from one another, on different days, at different times, just infrequently enough for the world to forget about them in our 24-hour news cycle. It's pretty smart. If China did everything at once, the world would label it as even more of a belligerent and untrustworthy actor than it already does. Collectively, these acts normalize displays of Chinese power, chip away at Taiwan's defensive resolve, condition the West into accepting higher levels of belligerency, and set China up for its ultimate aim. For anyone paying attention, the world has seen this type of behavior before. Vladimir Putin utilized gray zone tactics prior to and during its first invasion of Ukraine in 2014, dispatching mercenaries and Russian forces in anonymous green uniforms with no markings to do his bidding, destabilizing the local government and paving the way for Russia's annexation of Crimea. Putin told everyone he had no idea who these little green men were, as if. Their disguise as local pro-Russian separatists enabled Putin to claim plausible deniability for their involvement, giving him the ability to achieve his geopolitical aim without officially escalating the crisis into an unwinnable war. That didn't last long. Despite the Kremlin's reliance on grey zone operations, it ultimately could not get everything it wanted without a bigger, pre-planned invasion. And here, China will have certainly taken note. Before 2022, the West could only respond to what seemed a measured, limited invasion with measured, limited sanctions. China can and does expect the same when it pulls similar stunts in the South China Sea. The United States, as yet, hasn't been able to do much to challenge China's construction of artificial islands or its repeated violation of Taiwanese airspace, since it is short of a pronounced, conventional invasion. China can harass and weaken Taiwan in limited ways and still not be seen as overt aggressors. The West can apply economic, political, and diplomatic pressure, but China has weathered this type of response for decades now. Russia's switch from grey zone tactics to full-blown warfare has given China insight into the West's response, and it probably doesn't like what it has seen. The world rallied behind Ukraine, pouring billions of dollars worth of arms and aid into the fight. Its alliances grew stronger, its commitment to defending vulnerable nations, even indirectly, more firm. China now knows what it can expect in a similar Taiwan contingency. If they had plans to invade in the near future, they have probably shelved them for now, and rightly so. Just another reason why Putin's war has not only benefited the West, but also deterred China in the East. There are other lessons to be taken from Russia's invasion. Chief among them, China has learned that size isn't everything. China's military is excellent on paper. It has 2 million active soldiers, 500,000 more than the US. It recently launched its third aircraft carrier, which, compared to anyone besides the US, is a decent number, and now boasts the largest navy in the world by pure numbers. Its defense budget is surpassed only by the US. It has some of the world's best air-to-air hypersonic missiles and attack drones. But China sees that Russia too once boasted similar stats. From Ukraine, China has learned that material and numerical superiority doesn't automatically translate to victory. If it wants to successfully invade Taiwan, it will need far, far more. Russia had by far the more achievable territorial ambitions when it invaded Ukraine compared to China's designs on Taiwan. It had amassed so many tanks and mechanized infantry on Ukraine's border, it was easy to assume, and most did, that Kyiv would quickly capitulate. The countries are right next to each other. Russia had excellent railway access into the country. Save a few key waterways, Ukraine lacks natural defensive features. Russia even had a friendly partner in Belarus, whose territory it used to stage its attack. China would have to surmount a logistical Mount Everest if it commits to a similar invasion plan in Taiwan. Amphibious operations are among the most difficult to pull off, combining the intricacies of air, land, and sea warfare and the logistical challenge of transporting vehicles, men, and weapons across open water to contested shores. China has to cross the 100-mile-wide Strait of Taiwan first and foremost, a span in which it will be vulnerable to barrages of artillery and anti-ship missiles. If the fate of the Moskva, the flagship of the Russian Black Sea Fleet, is any indication, modern anti-ship missiles can in fact exercise a massively disproportionate influence over the battlefield. When it gets onto the island of Taiwan, assuming it can actually establish a beachhead, it will have to establish and sustain huge stockpiles of supplies shipped over in secure convoys, defend itself from what will undoubtedly be an onslaught of Taiwanese artillery, and withstand any counterattacks that come. superior numbers may not be enough to win out. Ultimately, the outcome of Russia's invasion is bad news for China for this one simple reason. You cannot intimidate your way to victory in war, especially when the enemy you fight has the moral high ground. Resistance will be fierce and pronounced. Taiwan will not give up simply because China outnumbers them. China has learned other lessons from Ukraine, among them the importance of training in the outcome of military engagements. Just as material superiority won't automatically translate to victory, armies will always struggle to overcome deficiencies in training. It is an indisputable fact that Ukrainian troops are far better trained than their Russian counterparts, mercenary, conscript, or otherwise. Most of Russia's most experienced, best-trained troops, commanders and non-commissioned officers are now dead, and Putin's repeated mobilization efforts have starkly revealed the deficiencies in Russian military training, whether the alarming lack of weapons, vehicles, and live ammunition to train on, unsuitable training sites, poor leadership, a chronic lack of technological enablers, or concern for the general well-being and training up of cohesive collective units. On the other hand, Ukraine has integrated a vast spectrum of foreign munitions, weapons, drones, and technology, eschewing older Soviet models and tactics for more effective Western ones. And that, in tandem with the intelligence they receive on a daily basis, has helped deliver several stunning victories. But while we often talk about the technology behind Ukraine's success, it's certainly no silver bullet. Western weapons are hard to maintain, at least in Ukraine, being both subject to breakdown and difficult to replace when stocks run low. In this discussion, we tend to forget the human element, how hard it is to deploy and use modern weapons effectively. Among other things, Ukrainian troops are road testing real-time online information and networking systems, drone jamming guns, and maritime remote-controlled kamikaze boats, Western systems that take a real know-how and expertise to operate within a combined arms setting. They are improving their intelligence and surveillance gathering efforts. They are becoming experts at psychological warfare, joint operations, and sustainment logistics. It's been a whirlwind crash course, to say the least. But they have not worked alone. As far back as 2014, Ukrainian officers were receiving Western training, especially from the United States, Great Britain, Canada, and other European nations. As early as 1993, Ukrainian armed forces were training in the US through the United States National Guard's State Partnership Program, learning to deliver mission-type orders, empower Ukrainian soldiers to make on-the-fly battlefield decisions, and using realistic combat exercises to hone the skills and wartime resilience of Ukrainian personnel. More recently, tens of thousands of Ukrainian officers have received crash courses in modern joint war fighting in Britain, Germany, Poland, and as part of the US Army Europe's Joint Multinational Training Group Ukraine, a blended task force of Americans, Poles, Lithuanians, Brits, Canadians, and other soldiers established in 2015 to mentor and advise Ukrainian battalions in the art of combined arms warfare. These train-the-trainer programs, arguably more than the weapons and munitions themselves, are conferring Ukraine a distinct battlefield advantage. The bad news for China is that Taiwan joined a similar US-led program in 2022 and have been integrating Western-built weapons systems far longer than that. Every day that goes by, their military will glean lessons from the best forces in the world, making an invasion that much harder to pull off. Speaking of lessons, it is a well-known fact that Russia underestimated the extent to which Ukraine would receive Western assistance after it was invaded, and China now knows that even if the United States, its allies and partners do not expressly commit hard military power to fight side by side with Taiwanese forces in the event of an invasion, it can be sure that the likelihood the Western world will assist Taiwan in some way is extremely high. Geographic distance from an international hotspot no longer hinders the degree of foreign aid or the level of intervention in the way it once did. Even though a vast Pacific expanse separates Taiwan from the United States, it would still send crucial military and humanitarian aid if China invades. Witnessing the astronomical sums of money donated by NATO member countries to Ukraine will send shivers down Xi Jinping's spine. Thanks to Russia, the West is once more alert to the tangible threat of authoritarianism. Gone are the days of ambivalence or neutrality when it comes to ensuring territorial integrity. China's hopes of the United States staying aloof from a Taiwanese confrontation are long gone. The US has proven willing to send state-of-the-art tanks,
high-tech weapons, and advisors to help Ukraine, currently facing its second most pronounced national security threat. We predict it will offer the same assistance, if not more, to Taiwan. This leads to another reason why Russia's experience should send warning signals to China. Just as it has drawn insight from the West's reaction to Russia's invasion, it must recognize that the West, too, has been learning what works and what doesn't when countries threaten to invade their neighbor. China may have taken some confidence from the initial response to Russia's decision to amass troops on Ukraine's border. The West could only threaten to proportionately punish Russian aggression in the vaguest terms, since, technically, it was all still hypothetical. The threat and implementation of economic sanctions was serious, but far from insurmountable. Russia had hoped to win the war quickly and incorporate Ukraine's vast resources and manpower, thus shielding itself from the worst effects of sanctions. Yes, they might temporarily make average Russians uncomfortable in the short term. The long-term strategic benefits of a rapid, decisive victory, however, couldn't be ignored. Once the war was over and Russia controlled Ukraine, it's fair to say that Russia might be able to slowly reduce the impact of sanctions and re-engage in dialogue with the West, as it had after it invaded and annexed Crimea in 2014. In a perfect world, China foresees a similar outcome for its own invasion. But Russian setbacks have shown that once the war spirals out of control and the aggressor finds itself on the losing side, the West will move from mere sanctions to deterrence through denial, deploying rapid response troops to the region to prevent things from escalating further as a preventative measure. Because the threat of sanctions was not enough to stop Russia from invading, and when they were implemented they did not alter Russia's behavior to the extent many had hoped, it is possible the West will simply double down on not only arming Taiwan with the weapons and training it needs ahead of time, but redoubling its own presence. This is what Japan, Australia, and other Indo-Pacific nations have already been doing for months now. You can be sure China would much rather deal with sanctions than the latter. Another takeaway is actually a corollary to the idea that the West will go beyond the threat of sanctions. It is the idea that even if sanctions are slow, they do eventually work. China is in an entirely different weight class economically than Russia. US and European officials are well aware that the potential implications of sanctions on China is a far more complex exercise than sanctions on Russia, given US and allies' extensive entanglement with the Chinese economy. At least that is according to Nazak Nikaktar, a former senior US Commerce Department official. China has the world's second largest economy and a massive global supply chain. The war would not only harm them, but the West, which relies on China for countless goods, from shoes to surfboards and cell phones to computers. But if the West is able to target specific corners of China's economy, for example its reliance on foreign-made microchips and telecommunications equipment, it could limit its ability to pursue a long-term military operation. This is what is happening to Russia, who can barely get the specialized parts and resources it needs to maintain its aging arsenal of tanks, missiles, and other weapons. It took close to a year for Western sanctions to show results, but it is happening. It has forced Russian leadership to look to Iran, North Korea, and even China for relief. It certainly makes Chinese leaders wonder if invading Taiwan would be worth the disastrous economic consequences if it were suddenly shut off from Western goods and resources, or sell its own wares in foreign markets, the bread and butter upon which it has built itself into a regional superpower. Any invasion is likely to cement sanctions in place for years, and China now has every indication that the West would be willing to sustain these for the long haul, even if it adversely affected their own economies. The invasion of Ukraine was a wake-up call to the US and the rest of NATO. For 30 years, it felt confident that the threat of authoritarianism and conventional peer aggression were relics of the past. A false sense of security lulled the West into believing it could retrench its security commitments and focus inward on themselves. In the years leading up to the war in Ukraine, there were serious, high-level discussions regarding the United States' forward presence in Europe and how far it should go to underwrite European security. It has the most powerful military on Earth. It is the backbone of NATO. If the US had to fight alone, it could certainly defeat any other country in an equal fight. But Putin's invasion reminded American policymakers how valuable multinational security collaboration can be. It highlighted the pitfalls of drawing red lines in the sand and not being willing to back them up. Now, the US and its allies are clearer about how active they will be in supporting their allies and partners. Unfortunately for China, Taiwan is one such place, and it has Putin to thank for the reaffirmation of American political, economic, and military support for the island. Had Putin never invaded, it's fair to assume that the United States may have drifted into ambivalence. With each presidential term, costs of projecting preventative power into the Pacific would continue to mount, causing debate over whether it was all worth it. Who knows, over time the US may have actually withdrawn many of its forces and shuttered its overseas bases, opening a window for China's grey zone operations to come to full effect. Now there's little chance China will get away with this type of behavior without serious repercussions. The US will keep a closer eye on China to ensure it doesn't try to mobilize an invasion force. If it does, it should take heed of one final lesson from Russia. If an invasion goes wrong, you can kiss your power and influence goodbye. Today, almost everyone across the globe besides Russia itself knows Putin's military is nowhere near as powerful as he made it out to be. Invading an independent, freedom-loving neighbor is a perfect way to turn the entire world against you. Failed invasions are tickets to infamy. They are permanent marks of discredit, disgrace, and disrepute. Russia has long since lost control of the narrative of benign liberation it touted as its primary aim. NATO has become more united and emboldened, and all from a failed invasion. If China launched its own invasion and failed, it would undoubtedly witness its hard-earned influence and prestige throughout East Asia and even beyond fade away. America's closest regional allies in the Indo-Pacific remain closely tied to China in some form or another, but if China invaded and embarked on a long, drawn-out war, it would see its regional influence shrink relative to its enemies. Just because a country is a major power does not mean the world can't live without it. Just ask Putin. Putin's invasion of Ukraine has been an unmitigated disaster for China. The powerful Eurasian alliance it once hoped to forge with its Russian ally is now severely unbalanced. The world is a completely different place than it was a year ago. Just as the West has wised up to authoritarian threats, China has learned that an invasion would be met with stout Taiwanese resistance and long-term Western support. Power on paper does not guarantee success. But what do you think? Will China decide to invade Taiwan despite the obvious risks? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more military analysis from military experts.
Will Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping become the world's next power couple? At this point it's hard to tell, but one thing's for sure, they have been and still are spending a lot of time together, and it's terrifying. In October 2023, Vladimir Putin made a now rare trip beyond Russia's borders. After the invasion of Ukraine, Russia's dictator has been largely isolated from the world stage. This is especially so since his indictment by the International Criminal Court for war crimes of unlawful deportation and transfer of children from the occupied areas of Ukraine. Following this indictment, any country that is a member of the ICC has the duty to arrest him should he step foot on their soil. There is one country that's safe for him to go though, the People's Republic of China. It was there that Putin went to participate in China's Belt and Road Forum, where he would be the leading guest. In his second face-to-face meeting with the Chinese dictator Xi Jinping this year, Putin praised his dear friend. Meanwhile, in his own speech, Xi declared his opposition to geopolitical rivalry, economic sanctions, coercion, and decoupling supply chains. Meanwhile, Putin said, Russia and China, like most countries of the world, share the desire for equal, mutually beneficial cooperation in order to achieve universal, sustainable, and long-term economic progress and social well-being, while respecting the diversity of civilization and the right of each state to its own developmental model. These are not mere buzzwords on the part of the two leaders, but statements of their vision for a new world order. But what is the new world order? Let's explore the relationship between China and Russia, Xi and Putin, what their goals are, what it means for the world, and whether this strategic partnership can pose a true challenge to America's global leadership. Since taking power in 1999, Vladimir Putin has made 16 visits to China. Meanwhile, after Xi Jinping became China's dictator in 2012, he has made 9 visits to Russia, more than any other country. The two men have met over 40 times during the last decade. Putin and Xi are like-minded leaders. Both men have presided over periods of authoritarian backsliding within their respective nations. They also share similar worldviews and foreign policy goals. Even when the cameras aren't on, it's reported that the two dictators have a good personal relationship. The two men have often called one another friends, and while this might be standard fare diplomatic language, Xi is not usually as complimentary of foreign leaders as he is with Putin, who he referred to as his best friend at a meeting in 2019. Body language experts have noted the warmth displayed between the two during their many meetings. For China and Russia, this is a new and relatively revolutionary development in their bilateral relations. For most of their recognized history, these two countries have been rivals. Their first formal agreement came with the Treaty of Nerchinsk in 1689 between the Tsars and the Qing dynasty. The treaty resolved the issue of the Russian encroachment into Chinese territory in Outer Manchuria. The treaty was seen to be in the Qing's favor as it limited Russian expansion to the east and south, preventing it from going south of the Amur River and reaching what is today Vladivostok. However, Russia never wholly gave up its ambitions in this area. It seized the opportunity provided by China's 19th century period of weakness and annexed the Outer Manchurian territories, which make up its present-day borders. The 1860 Treaty of Peking formalized this annexation. Tensions over Port Arthur, now the Lushankou district, followed. Again, a weak China was forced to cooperate with Russia's aims on its historical territory. Relations in the 20th century were even tenser. In 1929, the Soviet Union fought the then Republic of China for control of the Chinese Eastern Railway in Manchuria. Succeeding in the effort, relations improved when the Chinese Communist Party seized power in 1949, resulting in a formal military alliance between the two largest communist countries. However, they quickly deteriorated again after Joseph Stalin's death. The alliance ended in 1961. In 1969, a 7-month border war broke out in the Far Eastern areas that had been under dispute for 3 centuries. The border issue was not fully settled until the 2000s. Aside from these border tensions, the two countries often sniped at one another over ideological disagreements. For example, China accused the Soviet Union of having a phony commitment to communism. Things are radically different today. The Soviet Union's collapse led to the era of American hegemony on the world stage, a reality that neither country was fond of but had no power to do anything about individually. To make a change to the international order, both would need to swallow their pride. In 1997, Jiang Zemin and Boris Yeltsin, then the leaders of China and Russia respectively, signed an agreement. This was not a formal alliance, but it laid the foundation of the two countries' strategic partnership today. The declaration endorsed a vision for a multipolar world. Yeltsin said, "Someone wants to dictate order in the world, and we want a multipolar world. These poles constitute the foundation of a new world order." At a time when America's global hegemony was at its peak, the words seemed to ring hollow, but it was a statement of intent for things to come. Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin have both echoed the language laid out in the 1997 declaration. Both leaders oppose what they view as two prevailing features of the American-led global order: unipolarity and universality. Unipolarity is the idea of American hegemonic status within the international system, where it has the power to do what it wants on the world stage with little opposition. Both Moscow and Beijing believe the current international order gives Washington far too much power, and they mean to change that arrangement. Their aim is to create a world where they have a far greater say in international affairs and where the balance of international power would not be as lopsided in favor of the United States. This is what Xi meant when he spoke of his opposition to unilateral sanctions in his speech at the October 23 Belt and Road Forum. Because the United States commands so much economic power with the dollar as the world's reserve currency, the sanctions on Russia following its invasion of Ukraine have proven devastating and isolating for Moscow. China would not want to face the same consequences for invading Taiwan. In this, the dragon and the bear have similar interests. A multipolar world would not have one superpower, but a series of great powers balancing against each other. This arrangement has been the historical norm. China and Russia seek to restore it at the expense of the United States. The Chinese and Russian opposition to unipolarity comes from traditional balance of power calculations in international relations. For example, Putin views NATO's eastward expansion as an expression of unipolarity that threatens a secure balance of power for Russia in Europe. This is partly why he went to war in Georgia and Ukraine to prevent them from becoming members. Their sovereignty and right to self-determination were not things on his mind. As we will see in a moment, he considers these concepts an extension of Western philosophical norms that he does not recognize as valid. Xi and Putin's opposition to what they call universality is more ideological, and arguably gives the strategic partnership a more solid basis than if it were based purely in terms of self-interest. Both leaders resent what they view as the United States attempting to impose its ideas about democracy, human rights, and other Western liberal values on the rest of the world. For Xi and Putin, this insistence is an abridgment of their nation's historical experience and their prerogative to govern themselves according to their cultural norms. Both dictators fear that the United States would, if possible, overthrow their respective regimes. They saw the Euromaidan movement in Ukraine and successive periods of unrest in Hong Kong as dress rehearsals for revolutions at home that would topple them from their thrones. Rather than liberal universalism, Xi and Putin view the world in terms of separate civilization states and spheres of influence. To them and to other figures who believe in the idea too, like Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, separate civilizations are characterized more by their cultural ties than national borders or citizenships. Each civilization has its distinct cultural tradition, which the formal mechanisms of state power have the responsibility of protecting. When Putin mentioned that his country and China wished to respect the diversity of civilization, this is what he was talking about. He was resenting the universalism inherent within liberal political philosophy and stating that Russia and other countries would have to govern themselves according to their own value systems. Xi has echoed this sentiment. In another meeting between the two leaders, he reportedly told Putin that certain international forces are arbitrarily interfering in the internal affairs of China and Russia under the guise of democracy and human rights. By saying these things, both leaders were rejecting the notions of universalism that they see as a manifestation of Western hubris, with the United States as the chief offender. For Putin's Russia, these values have intruded on its traditional civilizational sphere of influence, which includes Ukraine. Putin sees Ukraine as part of not only Russia's political sphere of influence, but its cultural sphere as well. Under standard international norms, this worldview is a violation of sovereignty and territorial integrity, but Putin sees such norms as the very problem his invasion of Ukraine was meant to confront. This is the broader philosophical issue at stake in Ukraine. If Russia were to win at least a partial victory there and secure the territories it claimed to annex in the autumn of 2022, it would not only accomplish some of its geopolitical ambitions of establishing a better buffer for Crimea and the Volgograd Gap, it would also extend the Kremlin's claim of being the guarantor of Russian civilization and protector of Russian-speaking people, no matter where they reside. Other former Soviet states would be under greater pressure, especially if they have a lot of Russian speakers. A precedent would also be set for China's expansionist ambitions in the Indo-Pacific region. It would undoubtedly make China even more aggressive in its territorial claims. Taiwan is the most obvious target for Chinese expansion, as Beijing considers the self-governing island to be a renegade province. China's 9-dash line in the South China Sea is also an attempt for it to assert its civilizational sphere of influence in the region. China often justifies these expansive territorial claims by citing instances of its people's presence on the islands dating back to ancient times. Historians regard many of these claims as dubious, and the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague has entirely rejected the 9-dash line. However, that rejection itself is something that Xi considers an imposition based on Western norms of international relations that have little to do with China's experience or its proper historical sphere of influence. For China, these waterways are critical to its geopolitical security and its goal of pushing the United States out of the Indo-Pacific region, which it sees as its proper sphere of civilizational influence. This objective is a major plank in its ambition to become the world's leading superpower by 2049. In short, China and Russia share two important goals: reducing the power of the United States in international affairs and rejecting a global order based on liberal political ideology. To achieve these ends, they have entered into an era of unprecedented cooperation. Deep military ties go back to the 90s, when China began to import large amounts of Russian military equipment that aided in its arms buildup. This was an early indicator of the two nations' willingness to cooperate in the face of Western sanctions, as China was under such sanction following the 1989 Tiananmen Square massacre. China's purchase of Russian goods, meanwhile, were critical in keeping the latter's economy above water during the era of post-Soviet economic chaos. Meanwhile, once their border dispute was finally resolved, the two countries increased their participation in joint military exercises. These drills are designed to improve the readiness of both countries' armed forces and ensure they would be interoperable in the event of a confrontation with an enemy, almost certainly the United States. The two held their first joint military exercises in 2003 and have had more than 30 by the middle of 2021. 2022 and 3 saw cooperative exercises as well. For example, in July 2023, the two countries held a naval exercise in the Sea of Japan. The Russia-China exercise followed a trilateral set of drills between the United States, Japan, and South Korea to increase readiness in countering the North Korean missile threat. The Russo-Chinese drills, meanwhile, focused on missile and air defense, anti-submarine missions, and anti-ship missions. The operation was meant to send a message to the United States and its Asian allies, but it was also a valuable learning experience for China, which is still a fledgling sea power despite its huge naval buildup. China was particularly interested in learning how the Russian Navy countered Ukrainian threats at sea. For Russia, the exercise was a signal that it could still wield power in the Far East despite the grinding war in Ukraine. The two countries have also done naval exercises with Iran in the Indian Ocean. Other joint exercises between Russia and China include land operations in the Russian Far East, such as Vostok 2022. The two countries' air forces have also stepped up their cooperation. When President Biden visited East Asia with his Australian, Japanese, and Indian counterparts for a summit between the Quad leaders, China and Russia staged joint bomber exercises over Northeast Asia. It is not just massive exercises either. The two countries have increasingly done joint patrols, small-scale everyday operations to tie their militaries closer together. Sometimes Japan and South Korea have had to scramble jets in response. China and Russia have also cooperated closely in the diplomatic sphere. As permanent members of the UN Security Council, they often use their veto power, explicitly or implicitly, to protect one another and advance authoritarian interests around the world. For example, in early 2021, following a military coup in Myanmar, the two blocked the Security Council from passing a condemnation resolution. This was not a mere diplomatic show. Had the resolution passed, the UN could have taken steps like imposing comprehensive sanctions and arms embargoes. While any state can act unilaterally on these matters, actions from the UN would have had more robust international cooperation. China and Russia prevented that from happening. China in particular has close ties with Myanmar. It owns large oil and gas pipelines there and is creating the China-Myanmar Economic Corridor. China's state-run Xinhua news agency referred to the coup as a cabinet shuffle. The two countries have also cooperated in protecting North Korea from additional international sanctions. More obviously, it is for these reasons that the UN cannot more comprehensively act on Russia's invasion of Ukraine, China's territorial expansion in the South China Sea, or on both of those countries' human rights abuses. They have paralyzed the mechanisms of power in the body through their influence. Since 2009, China and Russia have also worked closely to change international human rights norms. In 2020, the two countries joined the UN Human Rights Council. China has blocked NGOs seeking formal accreditation with the UN and has also sought to promote a right to development in the UN, at the expense of more traditional rights. In this way, it promotes its model of economic development with an authoritarian ruling regime. Xinjiang serves as the most notable example of the right to development, as in the name of economic growth, China has demolished traditional neighborhoods and engaged in acts against the native Uyghur Muslim population that the United States and other states around the world have formally classified as genocide. Russia, meanwhile, has used what it calls family and traditional values as alternatives to Western notions of human rights. China has assisted Russia in trying to incorporate this set of ideas into official UN doctrine. Both countries have been keen to sway developing countries in the global south to accept these norms of human rights, as opposed to ideas about democracy, the rule of law, and respect for the individual. Their goal is to create a parallel framework that authoritarian regimes around the world can mimic and use to justify their existence. Economically, China and Russia are trying to use their influence to undermine the dollar as the world's reserve currency, using forums like the BRICS and projects like Belt and Road. China and Russia have sidestepped sanctions by using the Chinese renminbi for commodity purchases, while the former pitches like-minded countries around the world on its currency, saying it's useful for avoiding dollar-linked sanctions. However, despite their seemingly warm relationship and supposed no-limits partnership, neither country is keen to make a formal military alliance with the other. Doing so would undoubtedly cement Russia as the junior figure in the arrangement. China, meanwhile, is not eager to give Russia military aid in Ukraine and risk Western sanctions, much less get involved in the fighting there. For all the talk about its opposition to the Western model of world order led by the United States, China relies on trade with America, Europe, and other liberal democratic nations, especially with its economic growth slowing. So far, it has proven unwilling to risk that trade for the sake of Russia, a revelation that has been much to Putin's disappointment. China's peace plan for Ukraine is also vague. It would leave open the possibility of Beijing's recognition of the territories Russia claimed to annex there, but it also pays homage to the notions of sovereignty and territorial integrity, meaning that China would be able to choose the option most convenient for it. Additionally, China and Russia still have historical resentments that never went away. They have just been masked due to the common interest in undermining the American-led global order. The former Soviet states in Central Asia have been one source of tension, as Moscow has always considered itself the preeminent player in the region, but China has increasingly muscled in on it in recent years, as it's crucial to Xi's Belt and Road Initiative. More importantly though, the war in Ukraine has left Russia very much dependent on China. Moscow is now accumulating a vast stockpile of renminbi reserves, which are not good for trade in many places outside of China. Beijing now has a far greater leverage over a Moscow cut off from the West, and this could be critical in the coming years. The Russian Far East has many of the resources that would prove useful to China, and with Chinese people emigrating to the area in large numbers, it would be characteristic for Beijing to use all of its advantages to the hilt and reassert its old territorial claims, or at least force Russia to make deals with it there that are to its advantage. It would be a reversal of the events in the 19th century. Perhaps Xi and Putin have too much respect for each other to bring these possibilities to fruition, but they will not be the leaders of their respective countries forever. The lack of formal treaties and a true shared ideology, such as that seen in America's alliances, means that the new relationship between Moscow and Beijing will always in some ways be based on personality. Opposition to American power alone does not make for a lasting bilateral relationship. As Xi left the Kremlin at his summit meeting in March, he told Putin through his translator, "Right now there are changes the likes of which we haven't seen for 100 years, and we are the ones driving these changes together." What do you think about his words? Is the no-limits strategic partnership between China and Russia one that will create a new world order? Don't forget to let us know in the comments. Also, remember to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more military analysis from military experts. A potential hostile encounter with China now dominates the United States military planning, and vice versa. What would a war look like? Who would win? Before we get to that, let's take a minute to explain why our military experts have decided to discuss this potentially very real and, quite frankly, terrifying scenario. After the end of World War II and especially the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, the United States emerged as the world's preeminent power, supreme in military, economic, technological, and even cultural influence. After 1991, the United States was so strong that some experts believed it had transcended superpower status. According to their theory, it had instead ascended into a hyperpower, a state that dominates all other states in every domain in the international system. The world had become a unipolar one, even leading some observers in the 1990s and part of the 2000s, most famously Francis Fukuyama, to declare an end of history and the final triumph of liberal democracy as the last form of human political organization. However, the 2000s and 2010s threw some cold water on this theory. Costly American military expeditions in the Middle East, the 2008 financial crisis, Russia's expansionist ambitions under Vladimir Putin, Iran and North Korea's nuclear programs, and above all, the economic and military rise of China, all undermine the notion of unipolarity. By the middle of the 2010s, the Pentagon proposed its third offset strategy, which tacitly acknowledged that the unipolar moment was, if not over, at least under threat by the emerging coalition of authoritarian powers, led by China, who were opposed to the international order led by the United States. The United States was therefore shifting its military posture away from the counterterrorism and counterinsurgency campaigns which dominated its strategy following 9/11, when the unipolar moment was near its height, and toward competition with and deterrence of other states, especially China. This is why the US is currently heavily oriented toward preparing for a potential adversarial encounter with China. Let's dive into what kind of conflict might unfold and which side could emerge victorious. We can begin with a comparison of the size of the two forces. With 1.4 billion people, China is the second most populous country in the world, having been surpassed by India in April 2023. It has the world's largest military with almost 2.2 million active personnel,
The United States military ranks third in size with almost 1.4 million active duty personnel. When adding in reservists, the numbers increase to 3.35 million and 2.2 million, respectively. China also has the world's largest navy, with 425 fleet units in its active naval inventory as of August 21, 2023. This number excludes smaller patrol ships and other auxiliaries, presumably its huge fishing fleet that has acted as a de facto maritime militia in disputed waters. Meanwhile, the United States has 243 units in its active naval inventory, excluding smaller patrol ships and other auxiliaries. The United States has the world's largest air force, with 5,217 active aircraft as of 2022. China ranks a distant third with 1,991. When counting the total number of military aircraft with all branches combined, China's numerical disadvantage in the skies becomes more pronounced, as the United States has 13,247 aircraft among all of its military branches, while China ranks a very distant third again at 3,285. When it comes to air power at sea, the United States has 2,464 aircraft, while China's People's Liberation Army Navy (PLAN) has only 437. This is an important distinction and reveals that many of China's advantages are only surface deep. The numerical difference in the makeup of the two forces is important. A war between the United States and China would take place in the area close to the Chinese mainland, in the territory around the first island chain, a string of countries that stretch from Japan to Indonesia. China would be able to concentrate all of its resources there, and its supply lines will be much shorter. In contrast, the United States has global commitments, with Russia exerting pressure on Eastern Europe, Iran and its allies in the Middle East, and North Korea on the Korean Peninsula. All of these hotspots demand America's attention. The United States would also need to ship its supplies and replacements across the Pacific. These supply lines will be long and vulnerable to attack, the tyranny of distance. The United States has qualitative advantages, however. China's army has not seen major combat operations in almost half a century. The last time was the Sino-Vietnamese War of 1979, where the PLA had a poor showing indeed against the Vietnamese. In contrast, the United States military has had decades of combat experience and a buildup of institutional knowledge that the PLA simply does not have. It has more experienced soldiers, sailors, marines, and officers. The Chinese military has engaged in a large buildup and conducted extensive drills and war games with partners such as Russia, but there is no substitute for the real thing. Russia's poor performance in Ukraine shows that, and its armed forces had more experience than China's currently does. The United States Air Force not only has numerical superiority over the People's Liberation Army Air Force, but a qualitative advantage in those planes, although it may not seem this way at first. China has one fifth-generation fighter jet, the Chengdu J-20. China may have over 200 of these in service, a number which could hit as high as 1,000 by 2030 if current production rates continue. It may also have over 240 of the advanced fourth-generation plus J-16 fighters in service. This is a formidable force for the PLAAF. In contrast, the United States has only built 187 of its best fifth-generation fighter jets, the F-22 Raptor. The last one was delivered in 2012, and the Air Force has no plans to order any more. However, the United States can supplement the extremely high-quality Raptor with the fifth-generation F-35 Lightning II. Over 960 F-35s have been delivered as of August 2023. The United States also has thousands of advanced fourth-generation fighter jets like the F-15 Eagle, F-16 Fighting Falcon, and the F-18 Super Hornet available. And all of them come with better trained and more experienced pilots than their Chinese counterparts. Although China has closed the gap, the United States is still supreme in the world's skies, and in an all-out air battle, the Americans would eventually establish air superiority. The war at sea is also not favorable to China. The People's Liberation Army Navy may have a bigger fleet in terms of sheer numbers, but the United States Navy has purposely chosen to pursue a different strategy than its Chinese counterpart. Numbers aren't everything. Many of the Chinese vessels are small and would prove relatively poor in a military confrontation. In contrast, the USN operates sturdier, more powerful vessels. For example, the PLAN has 3 aircraft carriers, only one of which uses a modern catapult system. The USN has 11, all of which are more modern than the first 2 Chinese carriers. China has plans to make more aircraft carriers in the years to come, but as of now, the United States has a significant advantage. Additionally, China has a serious shortage of trained naval aviators. The PLAN is trying its best to catch up, but it's still far short. As a conflict between the United States and China would mainly be fought in the seas and skies around the First Island chain, with comparatively limited land operations, the traditional balance of power should favor the United States in a head-to-head confrontation. However, China has recognized this and has adapted with a strategy of anti-access area denial, A2AD. One of the things that marked the United States' emergence as a supposed hyperpower following the end of the Cold War was its ability to project power anywhere on the globe within hours. Perhaps one of the best examples was the Navy SEAL raid on Osama bin Laden's compound in 2011. This complicated military operation occurred without the Pakistani government's knowledge, and there was little that Pakistan could do about it except raise a protest afterward. After the end of the Cold War, the United States had no peer competitor in the international system, which could prevent it from using its military resources in the way it wanted. However, this began to change with China's military buildup. China's A2AD strategy sounds complicated, but it's relatively simple. First, it is to deny its adversaries freedom of movement in the disputed region, anti-access. To do this, it will utilize certain assets, especially cheap precision ballistic and cruise missiles, to destroy key targets in offensive strikes. The second leg of the strategy is to use defensive systems to deny the enemy the ability to operate in territory controlled by it or other friendly powers. For example, China would try to use its stockpile of thousands of cheap ballistic missiles to destroy expensive American ships, especially aircraft carriers, bases, and long supply lines to prevent the United States from moving into disputed regions like the South China Sea or the Taiwan Strait. Cheap ballistic missiles destroying expensive carrier groups would not only prove deadly and costly, it would prevent the United States from being able to project its power into the First Island chain and the Chinese interior. This is the opposite of what happened during the Third Taiwan Strait crisis in 1995-96, when the United States sent 2 carrier groups to the area. The Chinese did not have the resources to deal with this projection of American power and had to back down. The story would be very different today, and the move far more dangerous on the part of the United States. Chinese air and missile attacks on US naval assets, supply lines, and bases in Japan, South Korea, and even as far out as Guam would take advantage of the tyranny of distance to prevent the United States from being able to fight the war for the long haul. The United States might be able to establish air and naval superiority with its higher quality planes and ships in a confrontation, but it could have a hard time replacing losses and bringing more resources over. Meanwhile, China would be operating close to its own territory. The supply lines would be much shorter and easier to defend with its air and sea defense systems, and all of China's resources would be concentrated here. In addition to these kinetic assets, China has tried to develop its electronic and cybernetic warfare capabilities to further disrupt the US military capability. China's military buildup and its A2AD weapons has posed the most serious challenge to US military might since the Cold War. It is why many experts believe that the United States is slowly but steadily losing its traditional military superiority in the Indo-Pacific region. To defeat China's A2AD strategy, the Pentagon developed its third offset strategy. China hopes that the development of advanced A2AD capabilities will deter the United States from even disputing its expansionist moves. This is why for the Pentagon, it is important to maintain forward presence capability. It must be able to defeat the attempts to impede the movement of American military forces and surge them forward in a combat-credible posture. According to the US Army's Center for Lessons Learned, the third offset strategy involves forces that are or can rapidly get forward, survive a withering Chinese or Russian assault, and blunt the adversary's aggression. It is almost reminiscent of a boxer trying to duck and slip past a barrage of long jabs to get inside his opponent's range and deliver power blows. The United States is currently developing technologies to better prepare it to pursue this strategy. For example, these new technologies would involve better artificial intelligence to enable human officers to make faster and more informed decisions. The integration of human and unmanned platforms, like the Sea Hunter autonomous drone ship, would also be part of the third offset strategy. Other technologies like ship-borne hypersonic missiles and the Helios laser system can also be considered part of the third offset strategy.
as it is hoped that the laser will add a layer of protection to the US Navy's ships from the Chinese ballistic and cruise missile threat. The laser is also ideal for countering drones. The first Helios laser began seeing service in the third quarter of fiscal year 2022, and the Navy requested $35 million in its 2023 budget for Helios systems, when they will begin to become operational at sea. However, as dazzling as the third offset strategy technologies are, they are still works in progress. The United States neglected countermeasures against China's A2AD strategy as it pursued its counterinsurgency and counterterrorism efforts in the war on terror. Under current conditions, the United States military still uses many technologies and systems that are not well designed to counter the strategy China is pursuing. China still cannot defeat the United States in a head-to-head military confrontation, but because of geography, it does not necessarily need to. All it needs to do is prevent the United States from projecting enough power past the First Island chain to defeat its expansionist ambitions. As part of its strategy, American military bases in Japan would be targeted in the opening shots of the war, to destroy troops and equipment, prevent the stockpiling of supplies, and disrupt the United States' strategy in the region. Air defense systems would take down some of the incoming missiles, but China has thousands in its arsenal, and its attacks would certainly do a great deal of damage. Wargames done at the Pentagon and defense think tanks have repeatedly confirmed these disadvantages. In a January 2023 scenario run by the Center for Strategic and International Studies, the United States, with the help of Japan and Taiwan, defeated an amphibious invasion of Taiwan, but the casualties were enormous, with losses in dozens of ships, hundreds of aircraft, and tens of thousands of military personnel, with the US position on the international stage undermined for years afterward. China suffered heavily too. However, CSIS warned that deterrence needed to be strengthened immediately. Other wargames were even less kind. A 2020 wargame run by the Pentagon over Taiwan and other scenarios had the United States failing miserably because gathering ships, aircraft, and other forces in a way that would let them reinforce one another made them sitting ducks for Chinese missile attacks. To make matters worse, the United States lost access to its electronic networks from the get-go, upending the information dominance strategy it has used so successfully starting in the Gulf War. In response to the 2020 wargame, the Pentagon is looking to shore up its contested logistics, possibly through the use of rockets to fly above the war zone. It's also looking to find ways to aggregate power virtually rather than physically. Then Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff General John Hyten said of it, "You have to aggregate the mass fires, but it doesn't have to be a physical aggregation. It could be a virtual aggregation for multiple domains. Acting at the same time under a single command structure allows the fire to come in on anybody. It allows you to disaggregate to survive." He admitted this was exceedingly difficult to do, however. Finally, the United States would need to improve the defense of its networks against hackers, with a hacker-proof combat cloud. For now, though, these things are only speculation. What is not, however, is the United States' advantage in submarine warfare. China's missile capability has made it increasingly dangerous for the United States and its allies to project power behind the First Island chain with surface ships, but the submarine force is much better protected. That's why China raised such a big protest about the AUKUS deal that would give Australia nuclear-powered submarines. Submarines are ideal for the implementation of the United States' third offset strategy. American nuclear-powered submarines can operate for months. They are quiet and dive deep, making them difficult to detect. They can also launch conventional or nuclear-armed ballistic or cruise missiles to strike sensitive targets. The United States submarine fleet would make any invasion of Taiwan or other amphibious operations in the First Island chain a costly proposition for the Chinese military. The presence of these submarines also gives the United States significant conventional or nuclear first strike options to attack targets on land, such as Chinese military installations, which house the ballistic missiles that are such a threat to surface ships and land bases. China's PLAN is trying to close the submarine gap. At the moment, though, the bulk of its underwater fleet consists of diesel-electric submarines. They are quieter than nuclear submarines when running on electric power, but most surface to charge their batteries and are much louder when running on diesel power during this process. As of March 2023, China has a fleet of 56 submarines, but only 6 of them are nuclear-powered. The disparity means that the United States can carry out stealthier and longer operations under the water than China's Navy can. If a war did break out between the United States and China, The US submarine fleet would swing into action and attack Chinese naval assets, land bases, and shipping. The latter is especially important and reveals the United States' ace in the hole. China depends heavily on foreign food and energy imports. From its perspective, China's attempt to expand its influence in the South China Sea can be seen as an act of self-preservation. Critical shipping routes worth trillions of dollars go through these waters. Whoever controls them not only controls those dollars, but the ability for the countries in the area to access the resources. If China succeeds in closing the South China Sea shipping lanes, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and other American allies in the region would have a far harder time importing the resources they need. The same principle applies with China, however. A blockade of strategic shipping lanes such as the Strait of Malacca and the Strait of Luzon would cripple the commerce China depends on that comes through these straits, and much of its commerce is vital for its basic needs. While some of the Chinese missiles can reach that far, the assets being used to enforce the blockade would be better protected by distance and have more time to react to an attack. China is testing hypersonic missiles and is regarded as being ahead of the United States in the race for these weapons that would help its offensive reach. However, they are not ready for prime time and have not been widely deployed in the Chinese military yet. China would also greatly risk its naval and air assets in an attempt to disrupt the blockade. It would be the type of head-on confrontation with the United States Navy and Air Force that would put the Chinese military at a disadvantage. China may be the world's largest manufacturing nation, but it is still unable to feed or fuel itself, while the United States can. This would be the ultimate disadvantage in a wartime scenario, reminiscent of Germany's geographical disadvantages in World War I, when the Allied blockade deprived Germany of resources and slowly strangled it into starvation and submission. In a full-scale war, the United States would attempt a similar strategy. While China's missiles would ensure that the United States could not pull off a blockade in the same way the Royal Navy did in World War I, China would still be hard-pressed to break through it. So while the United States would be in danger in a confrontation in an area like the South China Sea or the Taiwan Strait, it would not necessarily need to go there until China is steadily worn down by the blockade and attrition. The United States still has a military advantage over China, but China is trying its best to close that gap. With its population starting to decline and economic growth slowing down, the dangers of a war breaking out in the Indo-Pacific may be increasing, since the Chinese communist leadership may begin to feel like its window of opportunity to remake the order in the region is closing. Regardless of how it would be fought, a war between the United States and China, even if contained, would be bloody and come at a huge price tag. Deterrence and diplomacy are more vital than ever. But what do you think? Who would have the advantage? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more military analysis from military experts. In the summer of 2021, China sparked great alarm in Washington when it tested hypersonic missiles. Some in the United States even feared that this test was another Sputnik moment. General Mark Milley, chairman of the United States Joint Chiefs of Staff, denied that the test was a Sputnik equivalent, but said it was very close to that. How real is this fear? What does the nuclear balance of power between the United States and China look like? If the unthinkable happened, what could a nuclear confrontation between the two look like? Let's begin. China has grown immensely wealthy over the last few decades, especially since it joined the World Trade Organization in 2001, and Beijing has used large portions of its enriched coffers in the drive to create a world-class military capable of competing with the United States. China's naval and air capabilities have increased enormously, but Beijing is now keen to share the love with its nuclear forces as well. China was one of the recognized powers in the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which went into effect in 1970. However, it had always had a limited nuclear capability compared to the true nuclear superpowers of the time, the United States and the Soviet Union. It had few ways of delivering nuclear weapons beyond ICBM launchers and silos, and had a small number of active warheads. That has begun to change at a rapid pace in the last couple of years. In 2020, the United States estimated that China had a little more than 200 nuclear warheads. By the end of 2022, however, China had doubled that number. If Beijing continues its nuclear buildup at this pace, it could have about 1,500 nuclear warheads by 2035. However, China is not only building up the number of warheads at its disposal, but the means of delivering them. In 2021, China appeared to be building 200 new nuclear missile silos in its Gansu and Xinjiang provinces. However, China understands that these silos are easy targets, so it's also building more road-mobile ICBMs, new ballistic missile submarines, and new bomber-delivered nuclear weapons. In other words, China is trying to create an effective nuclear triad of its own in a bid to protect its nuclear capability and, if need be, enhance its offensive nuclear potential. China completed the triad with its deployment of the nuclear-capable Zhanhong 6 bomber in 2020. Meanwhile, China conducted 135 ballistic missile tests in 2021, more than every other country in the world combined. The biggest buzz, though, went to its hypersonic test that summer. The July 2021 test featured a hypersonic missile that encircled the world before hitting its target. It flew for a total of 40,000 kilometers, the longest flight of any Chinese land attack weapon on record. At this point, it's always important to clear away some of the cobwebs. Hypersonic missiles, projectiles capable of exceeding Mach 5, are not new. Traditional ICBMs have long exceeded these speeds. What would make China's 2021 weapon new is its combination of a fractional orbital bombardment system, FOBS, with a hypersonic glide vehicle, HGV. A FOBS works by flying into low Earth orbit to an altitude of about 240 kilometers. This allows the device to remain below the line of sight of radar systems designed to pick up the arc of traditional ballistic missiles. Then, before completing a full orbit, the FOBS turns around and performs a retrograde engine burn, slowing its speed so that it will intersect with its designated target. The end result is that a FOBS can strike from an unexpected direction. For example, a missile launched to low orbit over Antarctica can turn around and hit Alaska. The Soviet Union experimented with these systems in the 1970s, but work on FOBS was abandoned after the SALT II treaty banned them, and Soviet submarines became more capable of launching ballistic missiles. China is interested in picking up where the Soviet Union left off, however. Beijing partially sees this as a necessity, thanks to greater American investment in missile defense systems following its withdrawal from the 1972 Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty in 2002. The second component of the system, the HGV, makes the FOBS even more unpredictable. Glide vehicles differ from traditional weapons in how they move toward their targets. Traditional ballistic missiles come at a fast but predictable arc. HGVs ride up to orbit, descend, and glide through the atmosphere to reach their targets. An HGV is able to maneuver, roll, or even pull up on re-entry to re-exit the atmosphere and then enter it again. Through these devices, an HGV can alter its trajectory while maintaining hypersonic velocities, making it fast and hard for missile defense systems to predict. China claimed that this test was of a space plane, not a weapons system, but this was a clever response. It exposes the overlap between space vehicles and these types of weapon systems. The hypersonic missile missed its target by about 24 miles. This is of little comfort if such a weapon were to carry a strategic nuclear warhead, however. The test also raised alarms about an intelligence failure, as US officials realized that China's advancement in hypersonic weapons was further along than they once thought. Potentially, China could send this new weapon on a trajectory over the South Pole. The weapon could then turn around and glide towards American targets, because American missile defense systems are focused on trajectories over the North Pole, which is the route that Soviet ballistic missiles would have taken during the Cold War. The new Chinese weapon would leave the United States particularly vulnerable. China's moves are intended to even the playing field in a dangerous game where it had long lagged behind. The United States has the world's second largest nuclear arsenal with 5,224 warheads. The United States currently deploys some of its nuclear weapons to 5 other nations: Turkey, Italy, Belgium, Germany, and the Netherlands. The forward deployment reduces the risk that America's ability for nuclear retaliation will be wiped out in an enemy-first strike. It also gives the United States greater ability to launch nuclear attacks of its own. American nuclear warheads were once deployed to Japan and South Korea but have since been removed. If nuclear tensions were to escalate with China, it's probable the United States would redeploy those weapons there, something the late Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe suggested could be a necessity given the current situation in the region, although he only made this suggestion after his premiership had concluded. The United States is regarded as being behind China and Russia in the deployment of hypersonic technology. There have also been major alarms about the state of America's nuclear triad in the last decade. Most of the weapons and delivery systems are many decades old. For example, the land-based part of the nuclear triad consists of about 400 LGM-30G Minuteman III missiles. This weapon system began development in 1964 and entered service in 1970. It's currently the only land-based ICBM in the United States military, and the Air Force plans to use it into the 2030s. Some of the United States land-based ICBM systems are so old that until 2019 they used 1970s-era floppy disks as part of the command and control system. Other parts of the IT system are as old. While this has the advantage of not being vulnerable to cyber warfare, it also means the system is expensive to maintain, as modern engineers are unfamiliar with it, and the Air Force has increasingly needed to rely on costly civilian specialists to maintain the old architecture. The United States maintains a significant lead over China in the realm of submarine warfare. However, its Ohio-class ballistic missile submarines are also old, with their plans originating in the 1970s, and the first vessels being launched in the early 1980s. Meanwhile, the United States has only 20 active bombers capable of delivering nuclear weapons. Its fleet of B-1 and B-52 bombers were once capable of doing this, but were altered to be conventional only in the 1990s. But these weapons platforms are also old anyway. In recent years, the United States has acknowledged that it allowed its nuclear capability to atrophy following the end of the Cold War. During the Obama administration, the United States made plans to modernize the nuclear triad, which took more concrete shape during the Trump administration. It consisted of a $1.2 trillion plan between 2017 and 2046, including $772 billion for the modernization of strategic nuclear delivery systems, $25 billion for tactical nuclear delivery systems, and $445 billion for facilities needed for the operation of the new nuclear triad. One of the primary weapons in this new arsenal will be the Minuteman III's successor, the LGM-35 Sentinel, which the Air Force plans to have ready by 2030. The Sentinel will come with new silos and a new command and control system. The United States is also working on a replacement for the Ohio-class ballistic missile submarine. This will be the Columbia-class submarine, set to launch in 2031, with 12 of the new vessels planned for construction. So important is this goal that the Navy has identified the Columbia-class submarine as its top priority program, a nod to how vital the US submarine fleet is to deterring China's ambitions. Each Columbia-class submarine will be able to carry up to 16 Trident D5 missiles, each of which can potentially carry 12 Mark IV re-entry vehicles. Although the United States has phased out these multiple re-entry vehicles on its nuclear ballistic missiles since 2014 to comply with the New START treaty with Russia, the missiles can be re-equipped with them if the need arises. China is not a member of the New START treaty. Finally, there is the coming B-21 Raider bomber, which is set to replace both the B-1 Lancer and the B-2 Spirit. The Raider was rolled out to photographers for the first time in December 22 and is scheduled to enter service in 2027 with a maiden flight expected in the remaining months of 2023. The Air Force plans to purchase up to 145 B-21s, depending on the plane's engineering and manufacturing development. As the successor of the B-2, the B-21 will be capable of delivering nuclear weapons like the B-61 and B-83 bombs. The United States has also been trying its best to catch up in the hypersonic missile race, and may have closed the gap. In October 2022, the United States launched a test of several hypersonic missile components. These included communications and navigations equipment, and a glide vehicle that can withstand the friction generated by moving at hypersonic velocities. The test was designed to validate aspects of the Navy's conventional prompt strike and the Army's long-range hypersonic weapons program. The Pentagon considered the tests a success. For now, these programs are only experiments, and the Pentagon has still not made a formal decision to acquire hypersonic weapons, according to the Congressional Research Service. Still, the Defense Department spent $4.7 billion on hypersonic weapons research in fiscal year 2023, up from $3.8 billion in fiscal year 2022. Adding these weapons to the United States' traditional nuclear arsenal seems inevitable. How might nuclear war break out? China officially has a no-first-use policy when it comes to nuclear weapons, even if its nuclear forces are attacked by conventional enemy forces. Only in the case of a nuclear weapons strike, officially, would China use its own nukes to retaliate. This policy started with its first nuclear test in 1964, when China declared it will never at any time or under any circumstances be the first to use nuclear weapons. This policy was reaffirmed in a classified Chinese document for the operators of China's nuclear forces, where it put repeat reminders about its no-first-use policy. However, there is skepticism in Washington. The document called The Science of Second Artillery Operations has a section concerning what Chinese nuclear forces should do if a strong military power possessing nuclear-armed missiles and an absolute advantage in high-tech conventional weapons is carrying out intense and continuous attacks against our major strategic targets, and we have no good military strategy to resist the enemy. This strong military power is clearly the United States. The document suggests that Chinese nuclear forces should lower the threshold in this scenario and put its nuclear weapons on alert. This is an important distinction, because unlike the United States, China's policy has been to keep its nuclear forces off alert. Its warheads are not mated to its ICBMs, and its nuclear-armed submarines are not on continuous patrol at sea. This suggests that China takes its no-first-use policy seriously. By putting its nuclear forces on alert, China would hope to deter the United States from taking further military action and to not use its nuclear weapons in a potential first strike, which may be tempting as military tensions escalate, given the still small size of China's nuclear arsenal in comparison to that of the United States. However, the document's addition of the notion that China could use nuclear threats to compel the United States to stop a conventional attack made Dr. Gregory Kalaki, the China project manager at the Union of Concerned Scientists, uneasy. The use of nuclear threats to stop a conventional attack can slip into escalation if conventional fighting breaks out. Within the confined and disputed waters of the South China Sea, there are many places where this can happen. It would not necessarily take something as dramatic as a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. An accidental encounter in the South China Sea, such as during one of the United States Freedom of Navigation operations, FONOPs, could be the trigger to a broader conflict via miscalculation. Close military calls between the United States and Chinese armed forces have happened during these FONOPs before, as China becomes more and more aggressive in asserting its territorial claims in the area, claims that the United States does not recognize. Suppose it's the year 2031. The United States and China are at a standoff over an attempted blockade of the South China Sea's shipping lanes to Taiwan or another American ally in the region. A FONOP leads to a protracted firefight between vessels of the United States Navy and the PLAN. If conventional conflict escalates enough, or if China's leaders consider themselves threatened enough, nuclear readiness of the like Dr. Kalaki suggested could cause further tensions and make one of the two sides believe that the other is going nuclear. For the United States, the threshold for a nuclear strike is lower than one would believe. It does not have a no-first-use policy. Authorization to use nuclear weapons can only come from the president. Critics suggest that this should be changed and that further restraints should be placed on the president. But for now, the president can authorize a nuclear strike at any time and for any reason. The only limitation to this authority would be under the laws of armed conflict. For example, if the attack would cause unnecessary humanitarian suffering, or if the attack's target is not a military necessity, the order could be disregarded. However, even in these circumstances, it's likely only that the order would be changed rather than halted. So if the president believes that China will disregard its no-first-use policy and resort to nuclear weapons in order to stop a conventional conflict between it and the United States, American nuclear weapons may take to the skies. Once conventional pressures heat up, the impetus to respond and create a nuclear first strike could become acute if the United States believes its missile defense systems will be overwhelmed, or if China believes that it will lose its ability to retaliate thanks to its relatively small nuclear arsenal. Preventing this from happening would require seemingly trustworthy communication between two sides that have already been shooting at each other. How might a nuclear war go? Even with its aging triad, the current nuclear balance of power favors the United States, especially beneath the waves. The United States currently has 14 Ohio-class ballistic missile submarines. Each can carry up to 20 nuclear-armed ballistic or cruise missiles. Some of these are deployed to the contested waters in the Indo-Pacific region. If a nuclear confrontation were to break out with China, the submarines would give the United States its greatest advantage. China is far behind the United States when it comes to underwater warfare. Detecting America's nuclear-powered submarines is a tall order for China's People's Liberation Army Navy. In a nuclear confrontation, America's Ohio-class submarines would swing into action and attack important targets, such as China's Yulin Naval Base on Hainan Island, which houses its fleet of Type 094 Jin-class nuclear-powered ballistic missile submarines. In contrast to the Ohio-class, China only has 4 of these submarines, and the United States may hope to take one or more of them off the board by striking the base. Each Type 094 can carry 12 ballistic missiles, with a range between 7,200 and 9,000 kilometers. This would be sufficient to reach the continental United States if launched from the waters near China, but would threaten all of America's bases and allies in the region, plus Alaska and Hawaii. In a nuclear scenario, it's unlikely that all of the Type 094s would be taken out at once. Although they are louder than the Cold War-era Soviet submarines, they would likely be found before they could get into range to attack the continental United States. However, China is also working on a successor ballistic missile submarine, the Type 096, which is quieter and would be armed with new missiles with a range exceeding 9,000 kilometers. The Pentagon expects the Type 096 to be operational by 2030, further adding to China's nuclear readiness. Nuclear missile silos and bases likely to host China's mobile ballistic missile launchers would also be targeted by American submarines. Some of these mobile launchers may have ballistic missiles armed with nuclear-tipped HGVs. Examples would include the medium-range DF-17 with its DF-ZF HGV, which has a range between 1,800 and 2,500 kilometers. This weapon system became operational in 2019, and although it cannot reach the American mainland, it poses a serious threat to the United States bases and fleets in the region. The Ohio-class submarines would be hard for China to remove from the board. Dozens of nuclear ballistic or cruise missiles would come over Chinese airspace in an all-out attack. China has missiles capable of reaching the United States too, and America's interior nuclear bases, naval bases, and silos would come under attack. Air defense systems would destroy some of these, but any that make it through would do devastating damage. And if its hypersonic-related technology comes online, it would have greater success. Additionally, China's leaders have had a long-standing policy of targeting adversarial cities in a nuclear second strike. So even if the United States seeks to avoid civilian areas as much as possible in an attack, China probably won't. It's difficult to tell how exactly a nuclear war between the United States and China would go, except that it would be the most catastrophic confrontation ever recorded. What is clear is that China's nuclear posture is quickly changing from one of minimum deterrence to something far more offensive. The expansion in its nuclear capabilities allows China's military to be bolder in pursuing its expansionist ambitions. Before, America's nuclear superiority made it harder for China to directly challenge the international order led by the United States. That's now beginning to change, and Washington is willing to spend trillions to ensure that its biggest strategic rival does not eclipse its nuclear capability. Describing the current situation as a return to a Cold War-style nuclear arms race may be overdoing it, but one thing is certain: we are closer to that kind of confrontation than at any time since the days of the Soviet Union. What do you think about China's military buildup? How does it change the balance of power with the United States? And what would a nuclear confrontation between them look like? Don't forget to let us know in the comments, and subscribe for more military analysis from military experts.